Without these people, cinema doesn't exist. Welcome back to Foundations of Film, and today we'll be looking at cinema's greatest directors. But what's the benefit of looking at a director? What even is the role of a director? Well, in general, we can say that the director is the film's vision. When we think about what a film shows us, it's the director that decides how all of that will be shown. They are the creative soul of the film, and our vision of cinema exists because of filmmakers that permitted us to see the world through their lens. But why hone in on filmmakers and not just great films? Well, what we must understand is that films can only be told through a voice. No film exists in a vacuum, and behind every movie that you've seen lay a style that came from a person with a distinct method. It may seem invisible to us at first, but the perspective of the person behind the camera is the reason why we see what we see. Their decisions are infinite. Why must the camera move this way? What should the pace of the sequence be? What should be left out? And these voices, these approaches, are typically consistent through an individual's filmography. Now, a collection of films is a completely different thing than watching a single film in that you can compare them. And comparison is one of the most necessary skills you can develop in watching films. It's a way of taking the reference that we're building and actually applying it. And one of the best ways to begin using it is in the comparison of filmmakers. So the first benefit of this is that by learning more about filmmakers, you're aware more so of what lens the film is being told from. A filmmaker that you're more well versed in, you know how they show things, what they're interested in. Very often, directors in their repertoire will reuse techniques, thematics that become instantly recognizable when delving further into their work. So what is it that we gain from these individual voices? Well, think of it like a sport. Some athletes may play the same positions, but they will play them completely differently. And this is the same as a director. They all direct, but how is it that they direct a film? And upon collecting information of various directors, we can then apply a further comparison, one that emerges between two voices, measuring collections of work against another. How do filmmakers differ in pace? What is it that they both attempt to say with similar or differing techniques? The voice of a filmmaker should be one of the first things we understand about film, because these are the people that have mastered the form, those who comprehend its purposes more than any others. And this list is a foundational list of such voices that are fundamental in understanding the broad spectrum of approaches that have thus far made up the cinematic landscape. I've selected over 70 filmmakers, but in doing so, there are so many that are not mentioned. For every filmmaker shown, there are at least another 3 who are not. And thus far, all the filmmakers shown in this introduction are not mentioned, but this makes them no less masterful. The purpose of this list is to elucidate what makes these foundational filmmakers important, and as such, these should be the people whose language we should master and understand first to show us the far expanses of cinematic possibility. The language of cinema is infinite, but today, the aim is for you to gain a collection of eclectic filmmakers whose filmography you will hopefully delve into and begin to understand its importance. Each section will be a small dive into the techniques, context, and what each filmmaker offered to the story of film. If you're intrigued in any of these filmmakers, go and discover more about them. Many of them have writings that further elucidate their approach to their art form. They have interviews and publications that help us further understand their approach. The filmmaker is the voice of cinema. Ultimately, they are cinema. And today, we shall look at some of the best. This is Foundations of Film, the Masters of Cinema. Georges Méliès. How can we talk about the masters of cinema without the person who gave us the idea of the magic of the movies? Georges Méliès was a magician, literally. He worked in France through the 19th century and managed to attend one of the private screenings of the Lumière cinematograph, which upon seeing, he immediately attempted to buy. The Lumieres, being understandably very protective of their new invention which could change the world, declined the offer by Méliès. But inspired rather than dejected, Méliès decided to work on creating his own camera based on the Lumiere's machine. And he did, and he shot films with it. Méliès made his own films, and they were not like the other silent films of the time. Yes, they were shot on a tripod from an unmoving perspective that resembled theatre, but his approach was radically different. Méliès wasn't interested in the capturing of reality. Méliès was more concerned with capturing the spectacle of the unreal. His innate understanding of trickery translated seamlessly to the nature of cinema, becoming a pioneer for special effects. While people were still trying to figure out the best way film could be industrialized and marketed, Méliès was painting his film strips, splicing several pieces of film together to create new forms of editing, designing sets and stories that were not only treated as fantastical works, but furthered our literacy towards film as a whole. He was cutting between varying settings in order to tell his narratives, and his devotion to the whimsical was what made him a pioneer in helping sophisticate the language and structure of film. There's something so pure about Méliès as a filmmaker which I can't help but find some solace in, because he approached cinema as something childlike, as something joyful, a medium that could bring happiness to everyone involved. And so although many of the filmmakers we will explore here deal with the depth of the human condition and the seriousness of the art form, one can never forget that it begins with Méliès' filmography that was devoted to making a fantasy world come to life through the joy of discovering new techniques, something that we can also simply refer to as the magic of cinema. Sergei Eisenstein. I've mentioned before that if you are to formally study film theory, then the beginning of that journey will most likely begin with the theorists of the Soviet Union. And although there is great depth to be found in artists like Dziga Vertov, who for my money actually created the greatest edited film of all time in Man with a Movie Camera, the entire theory they developed regarding editing can find its genesis in the work of Sergei Eisenstein. His most pivotal work is of course Battleship Potemkin, which will remain one of the few films that must be featured in any kind of canon due to its importance of development of language. The arrival of Battleship Potemkin can only be compared to Dorothy opening up the door to Oz, in that the world of cinema discovered for the first time a world which it could no longer undo. Editing was the art form within an art form for the Soviet film school, as it was what differentiated cinema from any other visual medium. Eisenstein was the preeminent filmmaker to approach editing from a completely new perspective, that being montage theory. The priority of editing a film was less to do with continuity and more to do with what was called the third meaning, those being ideas that emerge when two pieces of film are spliced together. In Potemkin, this can be seen as the rising of a statue of a lion while a city is bombed. The two pieces of film isolated are completely unrelated, but in editing them together, they synthesize to create an idea. This is obvious to us now, but it's obvious to us because of Eisenstein. From here on, editing gained the opportunity to be an intellectualized art form within film, and as such, Eisenstein's work is closer to that of a mathematician than of a traditional filmmaker. The rhythm of film came in the number of its shots, in the precise timing of a sequence, even how the composition of a frame could be symbiotic with the rising or falling of a film's tension. More than a filmmaker, Eisenstein was a theorist of cinema, and his works, film form and film sense, are vital to fully understanding the intellectualization of his filmmaking. However, the same filmmaking prowess can be seen outside of his propaganda work post-Russian Revolution, with his fantastic and sadly unfinished masterpiece, Ivan the Terrible. Abel Gance. I always encourage people that want to learn more about film to return to silent cinema. It's an era of unbridled creativity because of the fact that influence and reference had yet to take root. There was no standard set for how a film should be or how certain ideas can be translated, and so everything had to be invented. However, there may not be a better artist to help uncover the joys of this kind of creativity more than Abel Gance. His magnum opus Napoleon is perhaps the most creative work that's ever blessed cinema, featuring an array of techniques that completely shatter our expectations of what cinematic language is, taking it to its most ostentatious edges. Combining 3 screens at once, attaching cameras to swinging chandeliers, it's so celebratory of innovation, and yet this was the language of Gance throughout all of his work. Abel Gance's role in the story of cinema was to elevate it, to become the art of the 20th century. Gance treated cinema with a religious fervour, as though it were a literal new language, whose methods of translation were infinite. Film for Gance was the medium in which the next Homeric epic was to emerge, and so he treated it with this dazzling spectacle, as though the respectful reaction we must show towards it is simply one of awe. Every opportunity that Gance had to amaze with his filmmaking, he took the opportunity to do so. He signed his films with his signature, the way an artist would sign a painting, because Gance truly felt that cinema was high art, even before others were aware of it. And by infusing the medium with his constant ingenuities, he showed all of us that it was exactly so. F.W. Murnau. Few filmmakers can profess to possessing a legitimate versatility. However, F.W. Murnau, in his short career, managed to have phases that would rival any great master. His most well-known work was Nosferatu, and his early films, comprised of collaborations with Bela Lugosi, possessed enough mastery of genre work that he could have simply been one of the foundational horror filmmakers. But Murnau was to be more than that. When analysing his work, in the space of a few years, Murnau made multiple masterpieces across multiple genres: Faust, The Last Laugh, Taboo, and Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans. These were films that displayed an intensely creative mind that, outside of German Expressionism, anything Murnau seemed to put his hand to, he had an intense understanding of. Sunrise is one of the great humanist films regarding the act of being in love and how love can redeem all of mankind. And funnily enough, he imbues this same sentiment in his Faust adaptation, all the while creating a silent epic whose visual aesthetic should be envied to this day. His understanding of the moving camera as early as The Last Laugh is a cinematographic feat rivaling the importance of Citizen Kane. The reality is that when watching a Murnau film, there is undoubtedly a horror thread that seems to run through all of his work. His draw towards shadowy figures, his constant inclusion in his images of darkness pervading, almost leaking, poisoning his images. But he still had the versatility to evoke the exact opposite sentiments. It's rather astounding at how confident he feels in his work. Murnau's name is central to the story of cinema, and if it weren't for his untimely death at the age of 42, I'm certain that his name would ring as a titan of the medium, which he undoubtedly would have become. D.W. Griffith. It's a name that rings through cinema and leaves a sting. A name whose only companions are perhaps Leni Riefenstahl and Triumph of the Will, that can profess to echo with the same uncomfortable realization that great art can be made for evil. D.W. Griffith is a fantastic filmmaker. In fact, I question anyone that disregards his filmmaking ability, and my immediate reaction is that you mustn't have seen his work, because upon watching the works of Griffith, to call him great is a vast understatement. The modern film simply doesn't exist as we know it without Griffith. His ability to imbue sequences with an urgency and an energy propelled early cinema into its first recognition of what modern cinema would become. The action sequences, the spectacle, using the camera as a guide for where the audience is being taken and what they're being shown, the ingenuity of Griffith comes in all scales, large and small. Many masters that are to follow profess their admiration towards Griffith, because through his advancements of film language, he was able to elucidate upon the structure of what modern film would become. He was the catalyst that took cinema out of its infancy and filled it with a life that simply did not exist before him. I encourage you all to watch The Birth of a Nation, because you'll never understand the importance of it historically if you deny the power of it as an artistic achievement. Benjamin Christensen. One of the most peculiar artists to emerge during silent cinema was Danish filmmaker Benjamin Christensen. His work, even for the time, was rather undefinable. Not that his work didn't make sense, but rather that to him, genre was a fluid thing. His most famous work is Haxan, a part documentary, part research, part horror essay film whose aesthetic is spectacular and enviable. However, when we look at his first film, The Mysterious X, we see the use of camera and all forms of mise-en-scène that were equally as revolutionary for the time. He's not as known due to being incredibly early in the film scene of Scandinavia. However, those that have been exposed to his work are made instantly aware of his truly unforgettable nature, a complete pioneer in the truest sense of the word. Buster Keaton. Talking about Buster Keaton is like making sure everyone understood a joke after they all laughed at it. What is it that I could possibly say? It's not just that Buster Keaton was funny or that his stunts were outrageously dangerous, it's the fact that he understood cinema to the level of a master and used that to make us laugh. I'll never not be amazed that a film like The General could have been made on sheer daredevilry alone. However, I'm jealous when watching Sherlock Jr. that somebody could have been so good at so many things at once. When you stop laughing at it and think back on what you've just seen, you realise, wait a minute, he's an incredible filmmaker. It's not easy to balance the content of a comedy with the language of film, because one can't distract from the other. And I think that Keaton, being as funny as he was, he knew exactly what had to be on screen to get the best laugh. Maybe that's just instinct, but all I know is that what he did perfectly. I don't know if Keaton's work is funnier or more impressive for his dexterity and ingenuity of filmic language, but what I do know is that he mastered both and found a way to synthesize the two, creating a brand new genre of comedy, one that could only be replicated by those that understood and loved the power of film. Charlie Chaplin. He may be the most recognisable face of all filmmakers. Often partnered alongside his contemporary Buster Keaton, the two approaches to comedy and filmmaking couldn't actually be more different. Oftentimes we remember Charlie Chaplin as a funny man, but not a filmmaker, and so his process has kind of flown under the radar for many people interested in the medium. And because of such, what's even less known is Charlie Chaplin's approach to filmmaking. Very rarely did he film from a finished script. When production began, there was always a vague premise or situation, but sequences were heavily reliant on the improv and moment-to-moment changes from Chaplin himself. In fact, Chaplin was incredibly controlling over his work. He had a hand in every single aspect of a film's creation. Why did the studios allow him such creative freedom? Because he was Charlie Chaplin. And in order to understand him, you have to understand what Chaplin was for the era. He was the most famous actor and filmmaker in the world, both critically and commercially. He was so popular, and that's what facilitated the lack of restrictions to his own work. Because of this, films of his that are now considered classics underwent constant changes in evaluations because Chaplin operated on a spontaneous basis, to the point that the narrative was often discovered as the film was being made. Many people regard Chaplin as a product of the time, regarding his style as nothing more than slapstick, which is true, there is plenty of slapstick in his work. However, compared to his contemporaries, Chaplin's comedic style is far more sophisticated. Almost every piece regards his characters with humility. His iconic character of the tramp wasn't a punching bag. Oftentimes his stories were about a decent man attempting to find dignity and about the struggle for love in a harsh world. Chaplin may be a funny man, but to anyone that's seen his work will remember it more for its beautiful takes on the nature of humanity. Fritz Lang. There were a collection of emigres from Europe that managed to break into the Hollywood system and forged into cinema a hybrid of American and European styles of filmmaking. Perhaps it was down to his longevity that Fritz Lang is often thought of as the initial breakthrough artist of this period. He managed a career that spanned many decades. However, it's certainly his silent works and earlier sound pictures for which Lang is most well regarded. Beginning in the school of German Expressionism, Lang brought with him a vein of darkness. His masterful films were reflections of the recognisable collective shadow that seemed to be rising in mankind through Hitler's rising power and the physical presences of evil. For most of the earliest thriller filmmakers of the era, Lang's is perhaps the director whose fingerprints we still see on the modern film. His brand of sinister filmmaking fused with entertainment was the forebearer and helped launch the noir film as we'd come to know it a few decades later. And when we watch films such as his Dr. Mabuse series and M, we see the beginnings of a form of thriller filmmaking which would reach its apotheosis in the 1990s. It's hard not to recognise a group of detectives trying to track down a criminal mastermind without thinking of some of the modern greats of cinema and television today. Lang's work remains incredibly modern by today's standards. He understood what makes audience tick and the kind of dark drama that we were intrigued in. It's quite amazing to see how closely his work communicates with the work of today. And we talk about Lang as if he was just exclusively this. And that's without even mentioning that his most long-lasting film is Metropolis, the film which built the mould for the sci-fi epic. Victor Sjostrom. The legacy of Victor Sjostrom may come in his technical innovations. However, it's also one steeped in the emotional integrity that his images offer. When you watch the work of Sjostrom, you see a world whose entire surroundings reflect the character. The background acts as a mirror. The darkened and lonesome nature of the phantom carriage, or a billowing force that annihilates the boundaries you build to protect yourself in the wind. Sjostrom became one of the largest influences for Bergman, so much so to the point that he cast Sjostrom as the main role in Wild Strawberries, but that influence is evident. There's something powerfully silent about Sjostrom's work, even when compared to his silent contemporaries. His work appears to evoke something ghostly, something still. His camera lingers and makes us incredibly aware of the spirituality that seeps out of his images. Sjostrom may be a filmmaker that revolutionized special effects in cinema the same way that someone like Melies did, showing us the camera's capacity with double exposures, dissolves, but his techniques displayed the ethereal quality of film, a form of filmmaking that wasn't there to titillate, but to make us ponder and reflect upon those moments we experience that echo for lifetimes. Alfred Hitchcock. In many ways, Hitchcock is the complete director. When learning the absolute foundations of cinematic language, the filmmaker that could summarise its totality perhaps better than anyone else is Hitchcock. With a career spanning several decades, it was amazing how well Hitchcock managed to keep his idiosyncratic style while manoeuvring across the shifting landscape of cinema. Donning the moniker the Master of Suspense, he became the first director star, when he, rather than his actors, was the bigger name associated with his films. The Hitchcock style is perhaps most symbiotic with the thriller genre, as that's what 90% of his work fell into, and the techniques attributed to it were one of complete mise-en-scène. Every camera angle, every colour palette, every whisper of sound is an opportunity for storytelling beyond exposition, and each one that presented itself, Hitchcock snatched and managed to use for something completely inventive. In Vertigo, he developed the dolly zoom, simulating a warping of the screen where things appear to enlarge and get further away at the same time, completely disorientating the viewer. In the earliest days of sound cinema, in Blackmail, Hitchcock emphasized the guilt of a character who during a conversation can only hear the word knife repeatedly.
Now mind you, a knife is a difficult thing to handle. I mean any knife. Knife.
Whatever element of the film language it was, Hitchcock pushed it to its limits. Rope attempting to be a film in one uninterrupted take. Psycho utterly destroying the audience perceptions of film structure. And yet Hitchcock was and still is a universal director. He showed that to be avant-garde wasn't synonymous with being so esoteric that only a select few could enjoy your work. The thing about Hitchcock's innovations is that he developed a language that no one else was using, and yet everyone could immediately understand. Where his camera moved, the reasonings behind all of his decisions didn't need to be explained. They were obvious, they made perfect sense. If anything, Hitchcock's greatest gift to cinema was the reliance on a common sense form of creativity. Make the camera do what you think it should do. And in turn, he took cinema to its highest heights in all regards. If you want to learn about film in all its facets, then you can't go wrong with Alfred Hitchcock. Akira Kurosawa. Among the masters of Japan's golden age of cinema, the name which looms largest is Akira Kurosawa. It's the name of a filmmaker whose style is so all-encompassing that his very presence seems to linger in the mind of every other filmmaker who hopes to create work as impactful as him. Kurosawa was the Wagner of cinema, its sensorial overload of the highest caliber. Kurosawa is one of the most painterly filmmakers, coming from a background in painting himself. He was known to meticulously storyboard all of his work, and the result is an incredibly dynamic form of visual storytelling. Kurosawa's filmmaking career spanned decades, and although he was most known for his samurai films, he was capable of films of any ilk, any genre, any period. What ties his films together though is the sheer scale of his storytelling. Every detail of a Kurosawa image is planned. Every possible inclusion to the image was considered. He was the maximalist of the Golden Age filmmakers. He would employ the weather, cascading rain during a final battle, the wind billowing through the grass to display the internal turmoil of his subjects. When not using black and white, his colours were saturated and contrasting to their background. His compositions are made of giant infernos, marching armies, arrows that fill the sky. Spectacle is the key for a Kurosawa picture. And yet with this flamboyance came an equal level of substance. Whether it was the intimate tale on mortality of Ikiru, or the cat and mouse thriller of High and Low, the structures and narratives of Kurosawa would have still been successful without his mastery of filmic language. But with them, his works are, in totality, perfect. The influence of Kurosawa cannot be underestimated. The way that Griffith birthed the framework for the modern film, Kurosawa did for the epic, for the blockbuster. His fingerprints can be seen on almost every adventure film of the past 70 years. his ability to infuse a scene with dynamism, whether that be the inclusion of diagonal lines in compositions, the moving camera with high focal length shooting, the parallax movement of composition that employs an extremely close foreground with a deep background, slow motion to emphasize action, snappy editing to add style to the narrative development, even silence when needed. It seems like Kurosawa could do anything. And when you watch this absolute mastery of image and sound, you come to the conclusions that he probably could. Federico Fellini. Beginning his career as a prominent writer for Italian neorealist cinema, Fellini was known within the industry and spent 10 years collaborating with others before he sat in the director's chair. This is important because with a filmography as assertively autobiographical as Fellini's, it makes sense that he was known, because the arrival of his work came with such a strong identity. Fellini was not just a figure, he was a character of cinema itself. The alliteration in his name, the level of confidence in his work, how much of himself he was unafraid to insert. The work of Fellini is like the work of the first rock star filmmaker. To watch most Fellini films is to be taken on a trip through his life and his lens. The coastal city of Rimini and his celebrations of Rome are the locations in which all Fellini films take place because they are his cities. Fewer locations are as emblematic of a director as Rome is with Fellini. It's almost as if our idea of it didn't exist before he showed us what it truly was. Fellini's films evoke a particular brand of the love of life, one wherein the flaws are as important as the beauty. Fellini began his career as a cartoonist, and so his characters are often outcasts, archetypes. His worlds and its inhabitants have more in common with a carnival troupe than a traditional filmic ensemble. And together, they celebrate their imperfections, most of which came from the filmmaker himself. I always say when regarding Fellini that he's one of the filmmakers whose filmography is best to view in chronological order, simply because there's so much of Fellini in Fellini's works. Doing so, you get to see the development of a style, how a filmmaker becomes more self-referential over time, the numerous instances in which he physically begins to appear on screen. Fellini's worlds carry their own kind of magic, worlds in which the chaos of life merges with lands of dreams, and the beauty of living is found in the sometimes surreal concoction that is the spirit of humanity. His work is about the indulgences of the sweet life, in the vices that surround us, as well as the human inexplicable draw towards all things sincere. He was a maestro of his universe, a filmmaker who you could never tell if he was serious or not, but it all worked to fashion this beautifully individual collection of work. Yasujiro Ozu. Out of all of the many Japanese masters in the post-war period, Ozu was the most human of them. He may even be the most humanist of all filmmakers. Beginning his career during the silent era, like many Japanese films of the time, most of them are lost. However, the films that we do possess of Ozu speak of a language and interest that persisted throughout every one of his films. Ozu's language is one of the most recognizable in cinema in that it never wavered. Whereas some artists have periods within their collection of work, Ozu forged his style and stuck to it. When you see an Ozu film, you know immediately from a single frame. The truth is, when you've seen an Ozu masterpiece, you've seen all of his artistic journey. Ozu made familial dramas, simple stories with no great action. A daughter getting married, children growing up, parents passing away. Universal sentimentalities approached in such a vulnerable and beautiful manner that it's hard to think that anyone's done it better. Ozu shoots his films all in the same way, His camera's at a low angle and doesn't move. It shows a family household almost in tableaus, as if this is the perspective of the living area, this is the entrance, and so on. This technique was known as the tatami shot, as it most resembled the perspective of a Japanese person sitting on a tatami. When people speak to one another, they almost always look directly into the camera, and the world is interjected with sequences and shots for quiet reflection of moments of tranquility around us. What Ozu's style ultimately offers is a hybrid of an objective and subjective point of view. He shoots his worlds as they are without intrusion, and yet places us so intimately within them. His composition is one of complete mastery in both black and white and colour, with a geometrical rigidity throughout his scenery. His work is incredibly simple, and yet his films are some of the most well-composed of all time. Ozu's work, however, is most remembered in its importance for the human condition. His films are simply some of the most beautiful to be made because they speak towards the simple bittersweetness of life. To love and to suffer and wonder is part of the overwhelming beauty of being alive, and we simply couldn't trade it for anything else. And Ozu, perhaps more than any other filmmaker, captures that essence in its purest form. John Ford. There's always been some kind of barrier for genre work, perhaps an even larger one for genre directors, and perhaps none greater than that of a studio genre director. And yet when it comes to the father, for so many filmmakers, few would be able to negate the influence and sheer mastery of filmmaking language that became the benchmark for so many watching the work of John Ford. John Ford was a filmmaker's filmmaker, making over 100 films throughout his career. And similar to Ozu, Ford did have a style, though not as rigid. John Ford made westerns and war films, and it's easy to look at his work as a standardized view of how to tell a story at the time, but what you have to consider is that John Ford was the one that set that standard. It's as though he shot for efficiency. He knew what he needed to do to make a film, but for him, it's as though the thing he was efficient at was mastery. The way he stages crowds of people, his landscape photography synonymous with the mythos of the American West, the edifying of humanity amidst nature, it's difficult to overestimate the influence of his lens.
I can sure use that coffee. Pass the sugar, son. Fine. Oh, wait a minute, sister. I didn't get any coffee yet.
Ford himself was known to be a rather surly character. Every instance of him on camera and every anecdote regarding him involves him losing his patience or dismissing ideas that displeased him. And yet, his work carried the same cavalcade of characters that we would recognize time and time again because they trusted his process. He was prolific in creating a catalogue of work of such a consistently high level that it beggars belief. Sometimes it's difficult to measure an artist who creates so much. Do we isolate their masterpieces, or do we look at their work as a whole to decipher what it is they added to the story of art in its totality? Well, what Ford offered was a control with cinema. The often overly disciplined nature of an artist, that by things being their way or no way, the result can still be great art. Almost like a factory line. He used the motifs that he wanted to use. He refused to let people swear on set and absolutely hated zoom lenses. But you can see that his films are not ones of excess. They are exactly what they need to be, and sometimes it takes a firm hand for a gentle conclusion. Powell Pressburger. Better known as the Archers, the combined talents of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger resulted in what is probably the greatest directorial collaboration in film history. Powell was primarily the director, while Pressburger did most of the writing. However, they credited themselves with an equal share of writing, directing, and producing. This is because what the two shared was a singular vision that echoes throughout all of their films. Powell and Pressburger individually had successful careers, but they knew that their work as the Archers was them at their best. It was in their symbiosis where their strongest vision for cinema was able to come to fruition. The work of the Archers is a world of technical majesty, but even in their black and white films, do they share that same level of magic within them? Their films emphasize cinema's grandiose beauty. Powell and Pressburger's films were cinematic spectacle, not in scale, but in the breadth of their cinematic abilities. Storytelling through a mixture of colour and sepia, creating tableaus of an individual across their entire lifetime. Experimenting with the structure of narrative itself, the Archers were developing films in a style so alien to their contemporaries. But after all, this was their intention. The Archers developed a manifesto together as the foundational philosophy for how they would make films. In it, they emphasize that the only artistic judgment they follow is that of their own. They do not know anyone, aside from their financial backers, any promises or amendments for what the film would or should be. They wanted their films to be a year ahead of everything, a year ahead of schedule, and a year ahead of creativity of other films of the era. And so you can see in their works how they develop these incredible sequences of cinematic splendor that almost break beyond the realm of cinema itself into a theatrical production. Their films are based in our realities, yet they're the most beautiful renditions of our realities, where goodness of people is placed at the forefront and human achievement is replicated in the very fabric of their productions. When I watch The Archers, I see something that's often forgotten from cinema and the arts in general, and that is ambition. The drive to not only create something great, but the belief in one's talents to go beyond what you even know you're capable of, what anyone believes your entire medium to be capable of. And together, they exemplify the magic of movie making, and it could only have been achieved because of the admiration both felt for one another's immense talents. Carl Theodor Dreyer. Dreyer began making films in the silent era. However, once he made arguably his magnum opus, The Passion of Joan of Arc, every film he made after that was a masterpiece. Dreyer's filmography is one of transcendental silence and solemn pacing, making films of an exclusively spiritual quality. The otherworldly nature of mankind's spirit echoes through themes of fate and the divine. Dreyer was consumed by religious thought throughout his life, and he displayed this through his work. Even when a film like Day of Wrath emerged in 1943, explaining what it's like to live under an authoritarian and brutal regime, Dreyer explicitly pronounced that it had nothing to do with the Nazi regime, a movement which he vehemently opposed. Because Dreyer's work dealt with his worldview, a religious worldview, and the ambiguities and immaterialities that emerge from such a spiritual outlook. Odette is a film which attempts to infuse the world of miracles into our own almost as the utopic vision of life, and it's sincere in its depictions. He's a filmmaker whose work cannot be separated from the deeply religious beliefs that he possessed because they're sewn into the fabric of his work. The power of Dreyer is hard to express. There's an ardent passion towards the spiritual nature of mankind which expresses itself in an intensity that's unmatched even amongst many of these masters. Dreyer's directing style has always expressed itself as though there's something beyond, that in the sparsity of his frames lie the secrets to the enigmatic quality of human nature. Ernst Lubitsch. It's hard to be the funny man. It's even harder to take a brand of comedy to the level of sophistication that Ernst Lubitsch did.
Seeing a ghost? Why does this car suddenly stop? Everybody seems to be staring in one direction. People seem to be frightened, even terrified, some flabbergasted. Can it be true? It must be true, no doubt. The man with the little mustache? Adolf Hitler.
During the 30s and 40s, Lubitsch was the director for comedies, in a style so idiosyncratic to himself that his work to this day can only be described as having the Lubitsch touch, a combination of innuendo and subverted expectation where nudges and winks were given to the audience regarding the very playful approach to the propriety of social decorum. Characters are lustful, greedy, envious, but they're never cruel, and it's Lubitsch's constant playfulness that allows us to be on board with characters that may be immoral or cynical because they never lose their charm.
So they call me Concentration Camp Earhart. Well. Excuse me a minute, I'll be right back.
They're able to have very rational reactions to very irrational circumstances. By today's standards, Lubitsch's work may not appear to be all that transgressive, following characters that are thieves, a theatre troupe attempting to infiltrate the Nazi party. But what you have to understand is that these approaches for the period were radical shifts from what a comedy film was proposed to be. These are characters that find pleasantries in sin rather than are appalled by it. And it was a mode of being recognised by the audiences of the time, even if many studios sought to censor the work. But the reality was that Lubitsch's films were too good for that. It would have been enough if Lubitsch was just making some of the funniest films of all time, but they also happen to be some of the most tightly written films of all time. Nothing out of place, every joke landing with precision, and every action weaving itself into a delightful tapestry of cause and effect. It's all just the Lubitsch touch, and no one did it better.
You are a crook. I want you as a crook. I love you as a crook. I worship you as a crook. Steal, swindle, rob. Oh, but don't become one of those useless, good-for-nothing gigolos.
Orson Welles. He's known for making what's supposedly the greatest film of all time. Anyone that would have made Citizen Kane would undoubtedly have it overshadow their career. Unless, of course, you were Orson Welles. For what kind of mind could have spawned such a catalyst for the entire artistic medium? A mind of complete mastery of the form. A mind of absolute understanding of art in its totality. Welles is one of cinema's greatest forebearers. However, his perspective was more attuned to the arts as a whole rather than isolated to cinema. Welles had a plethora of knowledge taken from the fine arts, literature, theatre, that's rarely transposed towards cinema. However, his lens of arts as a singular coalescence undoubtedly influenced his filmmaking. Adaptations of the works of Shakespeare, video essay films about art forgery. Welles was a total artist, and what he did for cinema was done with the conscious awareness of a master of a form.
Now, however, I have something more than a hope. Jim Geddes has something less than a chance.
His greatest work seems so far beyond anything else that was made. He was cinema's first true Renaissance man. Whether he was writing, acting, directing, he had a vision for cinema that seemed so much greater and ambitious than others at the time. But Welles, amongst the Hollywood studio system, was the original auteur. He didn't adhere to the conventions and what was required of him by the higher-ups, always seeking to gain complete creative control. With this, he completely expanded the vocabulary of cinema and sought new possibilities for narratives and thematics in his films. He propelled cinema forward in the perception of a high art further than most others did. His work, just like himself, seemed to come with an excess, a confidence and assuredness that made Orson Welles impossible to ignore. Watching his films and their ability to reinvent the form, it's difficult to comprehend just how an individual perspective could have been so successfully innovative.
Ladies and gentlemen, by way of introduction, this is a film about trickery.
fraud, about lies.
Billy Wilder. If there were a legacy left by Billy Wilder, it would be that of the blueprint for the writer-director. Wilder's films are not regarded for their cinematography or their ostentatious manners of storytelling. Wilder's films excel in their most simple form, that being the screenplay. When watching a Billy Wilder film, you're going to see an incredibly taut narrative made of only the sharpest dialogue. Characters speak as though their lines have been plucked from a great well of sayings.
You're Norma Desmond. Used to be in silent pictures, used to be big.
I am big. It's the pictures that got small.
The back and forth between characters excel their dynamics because every line spoken by a person is filled with double entendres, metaphor, symbolism, and it can be something sinister or something comedic. Because not only did Billy Wilder write all of his directorial works, he also happened to be one of the most versatile writers in Hollywood. Wilder was known as one of Hollywood's forebearers of the film noir genre. Double Indemnity gives us all of the archetypes that would later flood the genre. The femme fatale, the shadowy voiceover of a slick-talking, troubled protagonist, as well as all of the visual iconography of our world that's being slowly overtaken by darkness. Wilder could keep an audience engaged like it was no one's business. He had a knack for gripping you and not letting go. But then, he was just as gifted at comedy.
I broke a nail trying to get the tray out. You want to buy yourself a new refrigerator. I didn't mean right now.
For every serious drama that Wilder crafted, he was penning some of the most influential comedies that cinema had ever seen, and he treated all of his characters with equal respect, as much as each film allowed. He was able to take typecast actors and give them career best performances in roles no one would ever consider them playing. Billy Wilder's worlds are the kinds of films that exemplify the golden age of Hollywood, because there's something to be said about executing the fundamentals to perfection: character, story, dialogue. When it's all done well, we don't need much more.
And nobody's pulling out. We went into this together and we're coming out at the end together. It's straight down the line for both of us. Remember?
Luis Bunuel. As one of the newer art forms, cinema has less frequency with being recognised alongside the other mediums within the grand story of art. Often when art movements occur, they're either isolated within cinema or occur outside of it. However, an artist like Luis Bunuel is one of the few that found himself embedded in the ongoing movement of surrealism. Going as far to have collaborations with Salvador Dali, nothing could affirm his place in the movement more. Bunuel's filmmaking can almost not be viewed innately within cinema. His artistic philosophy is one that exists outside of his boundaries, connected as much, perhaps even more, to the overarching art movement. There was in fact an official collection of surrealists led by André Breton, who welcomed Bunuel into the ranks as its first filmmaker. But because he made films, a filmmaker he was nonetheless. Bunuel's employment of surrealist imagery comes with maybe Jungian connotations, maybe they do mean something, but maybe they're also completely individualistic images, things that offer a reaction to the filmmaker and no one else, a kind of subjective truth. Initially, Bunuel began his filmmaking journey as a kind of rebellion against the bourgeois and their expectations towards art. This would become even more evident throughout his work, as Bunuel was not to create avant-garde imagery for the sake of it, he was in fact a very political filmmaker. He often targeted the Franco regime, fascism, and yet did so in such a unique individualist style that it never became meaningless. One of the benefits of Bunuel as a surrealist is that he always seemed to be aware that his image is surrealist, and so there's always this tinge of humour that pervades his work, as though he's able to recognise the absurdism of what's on display, all the while never abandoning the logic of his worlds, which all of his characters unquestioningly abide by. But what elevates Bunuel outside of the avant-garde is that his work did always feel like it had a lot to say, and he was able to demonstrate this with some of his best work being much more grounded realist dramas. His work may be recognisable by its uncategorizable imagery, but Bunuel's core mastery was that of a storyteller.
Raphaël, pose ce fusil, qu'est-ce qu'il te prend? Laisse-moi, je sais ce que je fais.
Howard Hawks. When thinking about the styles of filmmakers when you have to actually compile them one against one another, it's very easy to explain what distinguishes that filmmaker from another. But when it comes to a filmmaker like Howard Hawks, I've always found it difficult to say what it is that makes him great. The reality is he is one of the great American filmmakers. His Girl Friday, Rio Bravo, Bringing Up Baby, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Red River, The Big Sleep. And yet I don't know what ties these works together in an artistic vision. Hawks made great films, versatile films, but what he did differently, it's hard to say. But maybe that's his secret. The Big Sleep and Rio Bravo are genre pieces, but they're neither the originators or the most groundbreaking of their sort, yet they're some of the pinnacles of those genres. Sometimes originality isn't the be-all end-all, it's proficiency in what you have to work with. But thinking on his filmography deeper, there's a sense of wonder in Hawks' works, and it's something incredibly understated. Hawks was a filmmaker that didn't feel the need to try to be good at what he was doing. When you watch his films, there's such a simplicity to them. There aren't any twists or turns, it just engages in the delight of what they are. A Western is a Western to its bones. His comedies emphasize their comedic aspect, and in many ways, by them not appeasing to the requirements of a highbrow lens, they actually managed to become works of art that seamlessly ingratiated themselves into the canon. Hawks became one of the first American filmmakers referenced for his auteurship. The irony being that Hawks simply perfected what came before him and removed the branding of a director as much as possible to create films that feel so unintruded upon. They are the purest idea of what a classic film looks like.
I thought you would. You want that gun? Pick it up.
Ingmar Bergman. I find it hard to fully get across just how impactful the work of Ingmar Bergman is. If you haven't seen his films, then you've heard his name mentioned amongst the most elite of names within cinema. And if you have seen his films, then you understand just how difficult it is to explain the power of Bergman's work for both cinema and humanity as a whole. If I were to summarise what an Ingmar Bergman film is, it's a profound meditation into the most sacred places of the human soul. Bergman is a filmmaker interested in the human spirit. That means that he'll deal with death. He will philosophically ponder about the transient nature of people. He will think on religion and the power of miracles. He will deconstruct the very basis of art to find who and what we are and how we speak to one another. Bergman's films are not light films, but they're not also necessarily heavy films. They are just deeply serious. Humour is not at the forefront of these works. This is a place of deep human introspection, but in ways that you can't conceive of just how beautiful they are.
È come min famiglia.
Bergman's films are spiritual, existential pieces. Their themes are the narrative. The complexities of our inner worlds are placed at the foreground, with the subtext being the narrative and setting in which they take place. They are some of the most beautifully shot of the period, and this is thanks to his long-time collaboration with cinematographer Sven Nykvist. Nykvist iterated that Bergman wasn't a filmmaker whose storyboarding was down to the letter. Often on the day of shooting, he would communicate the kind of mood he wanted from that scene, and they would work from that. The majority of his pre-production was done in the writing phase, which he famously spent long periods on. But when examining his films, this makes sense, because they dwell within those personal, often impossible to explain landscapes of the human soul, and so in an attempt to traverse the longing and mysterious feelings we have within us, they can only be expressed through sometimes abstract means. A dance macabre on a hillside, a single colour overwhelming the screen, or the film collapsing altogether. Bergman is deeply philosophical as much as he is reliant on instinct, to just go with what the film makes you feel, as though it operates on a kind of dream logic. The fact is, whether you examine it philosophically or from a filmmaking language point of view, there's nothing you could say that Bergman didn't display the output of a master filmmaker. His films are the films that would be placed in a museum to display the pinnacle of the art form at its highest level. Roberto Rossellini. Most well known for his war trilogy, Rossellini was monumental in establishing the framework for what Italian cinema would become over the following years. The value of his work lies in its authenticity. When making Rome Open City, he was using the ruins of post-war Rome as his backdrop, shooting during curfew, using expired film to shoot. Rossellini established that film was a medium which could do so much more than just delight. It was capable of sending powerful, necessary messages to the world, and these necessary messages are what remain throughout Rossellini's filmography. Films of our common feelings, where narrative doesn't concern us in our daily lives, our lives are the narrative. Vittorio De Sica. I feel that while mentioning Rossellini, Vittorio De Sica should also be mentioned for perhaps the initial contribution to the movement of Italian neorealism. De Sica's work is more emblematic of the movement in establishing a new kind of cinema, films that are not glossy, whose stories are not even necessarily enjoyable, and yet many could argue that there's more of us in these films than any of the great studio productions. The films of De Sica are as simple as they can be. They don't feature actors, they're shot on location. They follow simple people with simple problems where injustice falls upon them through no fault of their own, but because life can sometimes be unjust. But De Sica as a filmmaker in particular features a dignity towards his subjects regardless of their circumstances. Be they criminals, be they outcasts, De Sica puts foremost that his subjects are people, something that the world of film too often forgets. He lays bare the topics which we sometimes struggle to tackle because they hurt the soul too much, but De Sica exposes them to the light and finds in its rays something healing for the spirit of mankind. Frank Capra. Frank Capra, much like Howard Hawks, situates himself in that almost invisible category of filmmaker where it's difficult to discern exactly what he does differently. However, when you look at his output, there must be something distinguishable. But with Capra it becomes more obvious in his thematics because his work has such an innocence about it. Perhaps it came from the fact that Frank Capra grew up in poverty and had an idyllic rise towards stardom in Hollywood that his films serve as the portrait for cinematic optimism. Although, at the same time, when we watch a film like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, we do see glimpses of the understanding of pessimistic outlooks and darker tones within his work. But regardless of their delivery, Capra's films feel primarily as though they are messages to his audience, that a single man can make a change to a regime, or just to the people that he loves, that true love will triumph, that even in his most serious of works, it's as though that Capra cannot separate himself from the goodness of the world, and a goodness that he hopes people will see.
Good idea, Ernie, a toast. To my big brother George, the richest man in town.
Kenji Mizoguchi. When speaking again of the Japanese masters, none were more ethereal than Kenji Mizoguchi. Although his work, similar to Ozu, was very humanist, Mizoguchi's approach was from a much more transcendental place. Working primarily in the Jidaigeki genre, which were Japanese period pieces, Mizoguchi used the medieval era of Japan to explore the quiet celestial scenery of the human soul. Mizoguchi was known for shooting in long takes. Often his camera would slowly drift like a lingering fog. His films evoke such grace, particularly his post-war films, which is what gained most of his international acclaim. Mizoguchi didn't shoot close-ups. He framed actors in a single plane, and his ghostly sound effects he would use as a leitmotif throughout his films. Sensorially, we never leave the spectral world that Mizoguchi establishes for us. His world is a world of the human soul, though it's also one of ghosts and the memories of spirits which still materialize in one form or another. His relationship with the spirit of people, as though told through a Japanese folktale, makes him one of the most profound of all filmmakers, and revisiting his work, you realise just how deep they go. Mizoguchi places the psychology of his characters at the forefront of his work, and oftentimes these are characters dealing with some deeply wounding grief, and yet he communicates this theme with the idea of a mystical and supernatural landscape that is physically present in his work. And framing all of this within this distant, lingering camera evokes a contemplation within us. We have to think about it, that we witness an image so powerful, and yet there's always space around it, as if we're looking for the image in context of something else and find none. It's a simple yet profound way of showing that this is the way life just is. Satyajit Ray. The principal figure in Indian cinema, Satyajit Ray's films give one a true sense of place with work that's intrinsic to Indian culture and yet came from a mind that was equally enamoured with many of the cinematic masters we've mentioned thus far. Ray's films speak of the life of normal people, living in both the rural regions of India as well as the contrast with its urban counterpart. You know you're watching a Ray film because of how it's shot. Although telling stories of ordinary people, Ray's films make you as aware, perhaps even more aware, of the context of these people, as their environment becomes integral to understanding them not for what they represent, but who they truly are. Ray's landscapes are majestic and are captured through a vast and serene perspective of an incredibly simple world. His films could be regarded as realist films, although I do think that there's a strong undercurrent of romanticism within them, particularly regarding his aesthetic. Ray exalts his characters with powerful close-ups, often framed in manners to deify them, highlighting their very human beauty. His scores play continually throughout his films as though they're just another fabric of the mise-en-scène, almost to a point that the music may as well be diegetic. It's so tied to the goings-on screen. But the realism comes with everything else. Ray would shoot on location with natural lighting, and his work is incredibly minimalist compared to his contemporaries. There isn't much within his frames to distract from the focal point of his films. His most highly regarded cinematographer was Subrata Mitra, whose first film he ever shot was Patappanchali, because he was by profession a still photographer. However, Ray chose him because he felt that those familiar with the moving camera couldn't adequately capture the mood he was after, Mitra revolutionized cinematography on the set of Patha Panchali by developing the industry-changing techniques for bounce light photography to get the most light available in the frame. As such, Ray's films have a look of the outside world which is still unlike anything I've seen. It's so distinctive, and it's because there was literally no one else in the world making films like he was. Genre noir. Genre noir occupies a place in cinema that stems from a long lineage of almost preordained artistic mastery. After all, his father was the impressionist painter Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Almost embodying that impressionistic wistfulness present in the movement, Renoir's filmmaking style is one of openness, of constantly moving parts, where the camera seeks to capture the breadth of the magnificence of life. His frames stretched wide, characters would wander in and out of them, and nothing felt supplementary. Every dialogue, every character receives no preferential treatment over another. Renoir's lens was one of coexistence, the upper class and the working class living in this symbiosis with one another, contrasts clashing, and yet his style never feels jarring. His camera floats, everything feels fluid and light as we move through all of these differing perspectives, which gives his films this playful sense of kinetic energy. We're always moving, always interested in everyone and everything. Renoir believed that cinema should reveal things to us, not that it should dictate the way things are, and so he shows us all of these varying, overlapping conditions almost as an empathic form of cinema. Renoir's films never shy away from the light-hearted or the comedic, but his lens primarily was to glimpse at perspectives beyond our own. These mass ensembles remind us that cinema can be a vessel for contradictions within itself, that a film can hold friction without feeling its tension, and that the highest form of this is what embodies the beauty of imperfection. John Huston. Before becoming a renowned filmmaker, John Huston aimed first and foremost to become a professional painter. Even throughout his filmmaking career, he was creating portraits, which is why perhaps Huston is not known for any kind of technical innovations, and rather he's remembered as a filmmaker for the tone he brought to his works. Huston never really settled on a signature style, or settled on anything for that matter. Having been married 5 times and having a cavalcade of women, he was the kind of person that was always looking to change, and this was something that applied to his work. He began making noir films before noir was even a thing. Then he was making biblical epics, adapting the great American novel. Although if there is something that ties Huston's work together, it's a kind of death drive. Huston was interested in people, perhaps that same curiosity that made him interested in capturing portraits of individuals, as his films dealt with characters ultimately seeking something that would destroy them. From his debut, The Maltese Falcon, we see his unmistakable flawed portrayals of humanity as they pursue an ideal that's ultimately a fabrication. Greed devours the subjects of Huston's work, as it was perhaps a theme the man himself was all too familiar with. But by traversing through his personal life, Huston made something quite magnificent. He was drawn to something elemental. We see it in the way he presents a harsh world completely indifferent to his character's struggles, and in turn unmasks the myth of what a human being is, showing them as what they are. All of their weight is removed as they're laid bare in their own hubris.
No wonder we had such an easy time stealing it. You imbecile, you bloated idiot, you stupid fathead, you...
Masaki Kobayashi. The interesting thing about Kobayashi is that compared to many of the other Japanese filmmakers that emerged from the Golden Age, Kobayashi was the one that became the most neglected. Both inside and outside of Japan, His work for the longest time was almost removed from the conversation of any kind of cinematic canon. Perhaps it was because at the time Kobayashi's depiction of Japanese society was something radical. His aim was to transgress and put forth his uncompromising vision. Throughout all of his career, Kobayashi didn't make as many films as his contemporaries, yet his style was just as salient. Kobayashi was interested in the schisms between content and form. His subjects are often men of conscience trapped within a system that encourages them to act against it. Whether this be the nature of Japan's relationship with their post-war beliefs, or the samurai code itself, Kobayashi saw a kind of disobedience to these long-lasting supposed truths for a kind of awakening for man to reconcile himself with his convictions. Kobayashi's vision was a severe one, dealing with human corruption and the erosion of human dignity, and yet rather than a realist or transcendental approach, Kobayashi possessed a strong aesthetic vision. Structurally, Kobayashi would take reference from Japanese folklore and theatre, with a film like Harakiri having the protagonist tell the story to another character, which we then see. The whole thing plays out closer to a traditional Japanese play. He enjoyed combining the customs of Japan within cinema, even if it meant to subvert our expectations of them. And he shoots in a rather expressionistic style, removed from the realist modes of filmmaking. The camera displays things from on high, as if we see the groundwork for the play unfolding. The soundtrack from Toru Takemitsu, who worked with the likes of Teshigahara, also brought that fusion of the traditional with a dismantling of the past. Clear focuses on geometric composition put Kobayashi in a category of filmmaker with one foot in the classic and another in the future. His work possesses this unifying tension across all of its facets. His films are one that have to challenge you, where you'll never get exactly what you expect, and the ongoing rift between the aesthetic and the content was Kobayashi's method of developing his own unique brand of moralist cinema. Stanley Kubrick. No filmmaker's voice rings louder than perhaps Stanley Kubrick. If you had 1,000 shots of film laid in front of you, you'd be able to identify which one was his. Kubrick's approach to filmmaking was interesting because a large proportion of his works are adaptations, yet the style he implemented on them was so his own that they may as well be original works. Kubrick worked with any genre there was: war films, science fiction, comedy, horror, but what they have in common is a Kubrick touch. So, what is the Kubrick feel of a film?
I've still got the greatest enthusiasm and confidence in the mission, and I want to help you.
Kubrick's work is many things. The first word that comes to my mind is that they're confrontational. Everything in a Kubrick frame is being addressed to you, in a kind of way that I'd describe as playfully aggressive. There's a kind of artifice within the worlds of Kubrick, because everything comes with an excess. Whenever costume is relevant to a character, it will be the most out there alien costume you could conceive. In regards to his film language, everything is pushed to the extreme. A zoom becomes rapid and intensified. A low angle encroaches on the character in such a way that their very being becomes warped. The same characters that stare directly at you under their excessively furrowed brow. The confrontational aspect of the film exists in all aspects. He shoots highlighting the symmetry of the frame, and so his one-point perspective is typically right in the center of the screen. It's as though the film is attempting to physically impose itself on our world. The artifice of a Kubrick film is a unique thing in and of itself. His films actually have an incredible attention to detail that most filmmakers would bypass, but Kubrick wanted that authenticity. if authenticity would be the right word, because at the same time, there exists this complete morphing of the human experience. When characters speak, they speak in the most intensified versions of what that emotional experience could portray.
A big black mark, I tell you, for everyone we don't reclaim. A confession of failure for every one of you who ends up in the stripy hole.
Jack in The Shining doesn't display madness. He displays an almost inhuman level of disconnection from rational human experience. And this is where Kubrick's cinema exists, on the fringes, presented on a pedestal, a grand stage for the most exuberant cinematic techniques to take place, made impossible to ignore. Kubrick's methodology was famously that of an extreme perfectionist. Stories of shooting the same shot dozens of times, forcing his actors through hell. But the result is a filmography which I personally describe as the absolute filmography. Kubrick's output is one wherein there's nothing repeated throughout his work. He approached each film as though it was its own isolated piece of art that required its own language, its own atmosphere, and spoke about its own things. Kubrick made these films as perfect as he could make them. He spent years on each film delving into it at levels other filmmakers would never dream of doing. Everything that he wanted to say about the Vietnam War is in Full Metal Jacket. Everything about being married and faith in your partner is in Eyes Wide Shut. And he was able to have this approach because he wouldn't let anything slide past how he wanted it to be. His was a complete vision of cinema, where every single project was treated as its own magnum opus. To film 2001: A Space Odyssey and say that the depiction of space was not black enough can be seen by some to be excessive, but this is what differentiates the masters, the certainty that greatness must be in excess.
You will not laugh, you will not cry, you will learn by the numbers, I will teach you. Now get up, get on your feet.
Sergio Leone. The Golden Age was a far more reliable era for genre work. Filmmakers like Howard Hawks and John Ford made the Western viable for many years. By the time the 1960s rolled around, those pillars had become less reliable. The changing times demanded changing perspectives, and perhaps did no filmer make this more evident than Sergio Leone. Sergio Leone was, for all intents and purposes, a genre director, making only a handful of films, but most of them being westerns, or rather, the new spin-off genre of spaghetti western. Leone was fundamental in the forming of the spaghetti western, the new transgressive vision of the American Old West, one of romance and honor. Spaghetti westerns deconstructed this and made stories of criminals, chaos, and style. The heroes of Leone's work are anything but, and were shot in a manner that exaggerated those very tendencies and would become synonymous with the genre. Leone's shots are big. He would shoot everything in wide angle. The scenery, his faces, whatever composition Leone settled on, you can guarantee that it filled the screen. He staged his subjects in frames within frames, playing with the deep focus of barren landscapes, making even distant figures appear so powerful. The thing about Leone's work is that you never don't know where you're supposed to look and what you're supposed to feel. It's like he came from the traditional school of filmmaking, but with an edge. Ultimately, his film techniques are the same as classic cinema. Clear staging, low angles for dominance, but simply taken to a slightly more extreme level that results in some of the best directed films of all time.
So?
Keep your shirt on, Capuano.
We gotta wait for the salt to dissolve.
There's a theatricality to Leone. His aren't realist works by any sense, just listen to his soundscapes. There may not be another filmmaker whose scores overshadow him, but few could argue when listening to Leone's work conducted by the masterful Ennio Morricone. Characters are defined by leitmotifs. In Once Upon a Time in the West, it's harmonica playing his eponymous instrument. In The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, it's the 5-note motif from the main theme played in different instruments denoting the characters. His films are their musicality, And it's that same blending of the romantic, the adventure, the brooding nature of the music, which is present in Leone's images. They're both incredibly obvious in what they want to make us feel, but if there was something that elevated Leone's work beyond the classically cinematic, it was that he just had a cool factor. Jean-Luc Godard. He is the face of the Nouvelle Vague, and regardless of what you think about his work, fewer filmmakers have changed the trajectory of cinema more than Jean-Luc Godard. Coming straight from Cahiers du Cinéma as a film critic under the tutelage of theorist André Bazin, Godard sought to reimagine the canon of cinema and possessed a keen admiration for the Hollywood studio filmmakers like Hitchcock, Hawks and the like, rather than the classic tradition of most European filmmakers at the time. But Godard's greatest contribution to cinematic discourse was that he thought the next filmic innovation was to come with auteur theory, the notion that the director must possess an individual voice to be the truest author of his work. And one thing that cannot be said about Godard is that his work doesn't possess a salient voice. Godard was the original postmodern filmmaker, his being the work you could point to if you required a definitive point to say that the modern sensibility of filmmaking had arrived.
Si vous n'aimez pas la mer, si vous n'aimez pas la montagne, si vous n'aimez pas la ville, allez vous faire foutre.
For Godard, all rules for filmmaking up to that point were thrown out of the window. Not only did he eschew continuity editing, he removed all rules from montage altogether. Godard's films are filled with jump cuts. A character may be speaking, and we cut gaps and phrases from their sentences. He invoked this kind of elliptical structure throughout the narrative. Rather than spending time developing the plot, he would purposefully not show it, and instead show two characters talking about the movie industry, or even talking about the idea of them being in a film themselves. Godard's films were self-referential, as well as referential to the whole of cinema. His work is closer to theoretical practice than any kind of traditional form of the visual medium. The philosophy towards filmmaking that Godard employed was considered amateurish at the time, but that was kind of what he was going for. To merge this lower level, this bohemian perspective, and fuse it with high art. And the truth is, he might be the most influential director on this list. Few people encounter Godard's films and were not instantly transformed at the realizations at how one could make films. Characters could have asides to the audience. Films could reference ideas on a whim and move on from them. Structure and discipline would be seen as restrictive once you've embodied complete artistic freedom. Godard typically came up with what was going to be shot on the day of shooting, and where most may see this as fortune or luck, there is something to be said at the schism that was caused in the art upon his arrival. He's the Duchamp of cinema, a simple question that we will never stop asking.
Parce que je suis très belle.
Michelangelo Antonioni. Antonioni was cinema's first real modernist in the truest sense of the word, in that he was making films about the modern world. And they were mood pieces. His narrative was one of the lesser concerns of his films, and instead his major focus was the disenchantment one feels with their surroundings. Antonioni shot his films in long takes. Characters often composed to their backdrop of a visually oppressive but spiritually empty landscape. They wander through them aimlessly, with no real destination in mind. These are people with a complete lack of purpose in their lives, and yet many have attained the bourgeois dream of wealth and success. Antonioni ushered cinema into the present world, one where his characters would communicate with everything around them, music, architecture, new and emerging ideas, and found that none of it seemed fulfilling. The reality is that when watching an Antonioni film, there is an argument that can be made that they're meaningless. I personally don't think they're meaningless, although they are discussing meaninglessness. Some may view Antonioni as a fatalist. His middle-class characters can often find themselves in states of self-sabotage simply to alter things, to find something different within their lives, because no answers are offered in these worlds which supposedly offer so much. But when our characters are shown as dwarfed within the frame, when their sudden shifts in life result in them standing in the same position as before, we see an artist critical of a world with no answers. Of course, we may be able to establish the utopic world visions of intellectuals as we never did before. We can morph and alter the world to our whim, and yet we find ourselves amongst people incapable of offering something new, something better, something worthwhile. This dreamscape of urban malaise is the location for all of Antonioni's filmic philosophy. Jacques Tati. In many ways, Tati not being a filmmaker first is what allows him to establish such a unique vision within cinema itself. If auteur theory is about the filmmaker holding a unique perspective and voice towards his work, then what could distinguish someone more than a person outside of the restrictions of the medium? Tati was a professional mime, and in the small handful of feature films he directed, he was the main actor, the character Monsieur Hulot, a silent protagonist wandering around a caricature of France that he doesn't quite recognise. Tati makes comedies about the absurdity of the world, and he tells us through pure visual storytelling.
There he is. You are going to be Napoleon. He's l'empereur de la cuisine française.
We don't think of his camera innovations when we visualise a Tati film. The first thing we probably think of is the set. Tati's sets are like giant children's sandboxes to play around in. They were often the most expensive parts of his films, and you can see why. They are the main character. For large periods of his work, Monsieur Hulot actually disappears off screen, and we catch vignettes of these pockets of the world. And when looking at them with an unobtrusive eye, we see just how ridiculous they often are. Tati's work shares more in common with a silent film than films of his era. He would actually record the audio after shooting and even have much of the volume turned down. He wanted his films to be an almost purely visual experience. And you know what? They are. Anyone from anywhere can understand Tati's films. They are collections of visual puns and identifiable quirks of modern society that are immediately recognisable. But this is the power of Jacques Tati. Because it's one thing to make a comedy about this kind of thing, it's another to make a satire. Tati's films are criticisms of modern technology and hyper-consumerist ways of living, showing how they so easily detract from a normal human way of doing things and how they can de-beautify our worlds. The recognisable follies that saturate his work are thus mirrors and ways for us to evaluate our role in allowing these worlds to exist. But rather than showing them for their oppressive power, he highlights silliness, and so they lose that power. And so Tati's depiction of life becomes a joyous one, that falling into these models of foolishness are part of the human condition. But as long as we keep our eye on true beauty, on our pasts, on the things that really matter, then we can enjoy the laughter that they bring. Alejandro Jodorowsky. Many filmmakers' works are some kind of an attempt to make conscious decisions that manifest abstract ideas from their minds. But that's not really the case with Alejandro Jodorowsky. Me explaining his images wouldn't do much, which I'm sure you can tell just by looking at his images. Jodorowsky is undoubtedly one of the filmmakers from this list whose imagery garners the most visceral reaction. His use of colour, the scale, his surrealism makes his work look almost undefinable, that they dwell in excess, that their purpose is to create something visually insane. And although they do that, the reality is much simpler. Jodorowsky is a practitioner of psychomagic, the idea that psychological wounds are to be treated with some sort of sensorial experience. Jodorowsky believes that certain images, certain acts, certain archetypes interact with the unconscious mind, and this mode of being is inseparable from Jodorowsky's work. The films of Jodorowsky utilize imagery from the tarot, from astrology, from generational memory, not because they're representative of something else, it's because this is what Jodorowsky sincerely believes. We sometimes look at works like this and implement our own worldview onto them. However, this is an instance in which to understand and appreciate the work, you must accept the worldview of its creator. Just as Dreyer was drawn towards a Christian fervour, Jodorowsky deals with Hermeticism, alchemy and mysticism with that same sincerity. What we may notice is that there is an extremity towards Jodorowsky's work. Just as we're amazed by his kaleidoscopic images, even amused by some of its very intentionally humorous satirical takes on society, we can also be disgusted, even frightened, when those same depictions turn horrifically violent. We see torrents of blood, acts which some would deem moral profanities, but from the perspective of Jodorowsky, we're nothing more than characters in a tarot deck. Every action is a symbolic gesture. Our very existence is an alchemical process made of blood and waste and water and sex. To him, these are not extreme thematics. This is the life process. You can't subvert these things because what they are is inherently symbolic. That is closer to the actual truth of them. His work consists of comics, film, psychotherapy, tarot, mime, but all are held under a single philosophy. John Cassavetes. Cassavetes created the benchmark for what would become American independent cinema. Beginning within the Hollywood system and creating some decently successful dramas, Cassavetes grew disenchanted with the changing tide and desired to make films his own way. What this ultimately meant was that Cassavetes was to completely transgress the perceptions of the studio system. Forming his own production company, Cassavetes made low-budget, intimate dramas that served as masterclasses in exposing the rawness of the human soul.
Yeah. Right.
I was trying to be nice.
Wacko!
I like your friends.
I know it.
Cassavetes wanted something new in his films. He didn't want films about plots. He wanted films where people interacted with one another, where people had to coexist despite their gigantic differences, where people love and hate one another at the same time, where people do things on a whim just because. There's a void in their life, but they don't know why, and they don't know what to do about it. There is no climax denouement. This is life, and it unfolds however it unfolds. Cassavetes' films come from a post-Nouvelle Vague world in which cinema verite offered a brand new approach to cinema, that we wanted that proximity, that the camera has the agency to look around and see what it finds in that moment rather than it being a pre-planned maneuver. There's a spontaneity to Cassavetes' work, which is probably why his films are so actor-centric. He didn't employ workshops or many rehearsals. Cassavetes trusted his actors and managed to maintain good enough relationships with them to the point that they could decide how scenes were going to play out. When you say what Cassavetes' films are about, you can give outlines. A Woman Under the Influence is about a wife and mother dealing with a kind of mental degradation. Faces is about a couple determined to hurt one another selfishly, but are still deeply in love. But beyond these taglines, they're about moments. Cassavetes' characters are the kind of people likely to go on diatribes about life, or they may react to something a character said in a completely irrational way. But in many ways, this is the complexity of real life. We don't have exactitudes for why we do what we do. Of course, there may be a broad answer to it, but nothing that could be explained through the digestible ease of a screenplay. And so, that isn't what Cassavetes seeks to do. His filmmaking philosophy is one of raw sentimentality. characters whose passion and pain is real, and a film language to let nothing interfere with the most important aspect of his work, which is the real-life soul of a real-life person.
Well, love moves at a hell of a rate of speed, doesn't it?
Pier Paolo Pasolini. Few filmmakers managed to have a career as celebrated as Pasolini while mired in as much controversy as Pasolini. Pasolini was an intellectual filmmaker. Perhaps he was even closer to that of a philosopher than a director. His filmography is one of love and poetry as much as it is about sex and violence. He dealt with taboo subjects throughout his work: prostitution, homosexuality, religion, all of which garnered controversy due to the contradictions emerging within his art as much as in his personal life. A Pasolini film is a provocation. Not that he aimed to make audiences uncomfortable, but rather that he challenged audiences in the most extreme of fashions. Large portions of his work include highly sexual themes, but this is because he displayed a distaste for the commodification of sex. At the same time, he was interested in exploring the alluring eroticism of sexual acts. For him, politics and profanities were just slight divergences in the exploration of human desire. Pasolini's films carry a grit with them, not in how they're shot. If anything, Pasolini seems to be that of an old school mentality from antiquity that seeks to exalt human beauty in its most classical form. He adapts the plays of Euripides, recontextualizes the great works of literature, and shoots it all in beautified compositions. The grit of Pasolini is something else. It's that all of these moments of beauty have a flaw to them. The human body is unclean. The gilded manor is falling into decay. A couple make love in the dirt. Pasolini's intrigue was towards a form of beauty which never made us feel a sense of comfort. There was always some kind of rot beneath his images. Go and look at his depictions of all facets of society, from the fascist authoritarians to Jesus Christ, and see how we all seek to chase some kind of divine sacred. And we do so through the primality of our very being. Pasolini's films are not one of sentimentality. They're powerful addresses to an audience which is equally as capable as being consumed by our own dominating obscenities. And if Pasolini was to create a disturbing form of cinema, he did so at a great cost. A cinema and philosophy that was so incendiary that before the release of his final and most controversial film Salo, Pasolini was brutally murdered.
Tutto è buono quando è eccessivo.
Sidney Lumet. If you want to see a filmmaker whose genius is almost invisible, then this is where to look. Lumet's work isn't flashy. It's rarely hyper-stylized. It's simple and to the letter. Lumet's filmography revolves around the directing of world-class screenplays. But unlike Billy Wilder, Lumet was an adapter, a collaborator, one who's concerned with bringing pre-existing material to the screen. And the majority of that material are films revolving around severe moral questions. You watch a Lumet film and you're constantly asked, what would you do? 12 Angry Men, Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Network. These are works that dissect the world as we know it, the systems in place that make up our society that we turn a blind eye to every day. And Lumet puts us right in the middle of it. What does it cost for a police officer to not fall into corruption? What's the price we pay for entertainment? Who really are our anti-heroes? Lumet in turn peels back the veneer of society and delivers to us characters whose psychological profile is complex and conflicting and places them in the most fascinating circumstances. Ultimately, Lumet is one of the most accessible filmmakers, because much like Wilder again, his films are not ones of excess, they are character and narrative. He actively made films that didn't come across as too aware that they were making art, eschewing avant-garde filmmaking techniques. He wanted the storytelling process of cinema to be pure, simplified. In turn, Lumet developed one of the most stellar filmographies for what all filmmakers hope to achieve: a universal story told in a masterful fashion.
I don't want to talk to somebody who's trying to calm me. Get somebody in charge here.
I am in charge.
I don't want
here.
to talk to some flunky pig trying to calm me, man.
You don't have to be calling.
What's he doing?
Will you get back over there?
What are you moving in there for?
Will you
What's
get
he
the
doing?
fuck back there?
Robert Bresson. Solemnity is not adequate to define what Bresson's cinema evokes. The correct definition of his work would be Bressonian. Few filmmakers are capable of receiving an eponymous adjective, but Bresson clearly is a priority in the list of those that do. If ever a filmmaker stripped away the excess of their work, then it would be Robert Bresson. A filmography painted with blank, emotionless faces, rigid, almost inhuman movement and action, an obsessive gaze of detail, and an almost transcendental approach towards suffering. Bresson's filmography is humorless, based in saturnine settings where hope is discarded. Some filmmakers we've mentioned celebrate life, but Bresson's lens is one wherein the act of living is almost the act of a martyr. His Catholic upbringing has been heavily written around in many secondary writings of Bresson. However, he himself regarded having a consciously strong awareness of the presence of God. God being all around us was something he aimed to capture in his work. As such, the suffering he portrays is indeed dour and miserable, but there isn't as such a fatalism within the work. At least this isn't what the films leave me with. Bresson possessed a completely unique approach towards cinematography, one that he articulated in his own writings to elucidate on his filmmaking process. Bresson wasn't concerned with realism. Cinema was innately artificial to him, and its essence of capturing image removes all sense of verisimilitude from, say, something like theatre. In essence, cinema isn't supposed to evoke sentimentality or any kind of emotion for that matter. It's to be a clinical and objective observation. As such, Bresson's methodology was unlike any other filmmaker. His collaborations with actors were non-existent. He would tell his actors exactly what to say, how to say it, and how to move. They were just vessels for action to occur, to the point that he referred to his actors as models. The rigidity of their action removes any kind of semblance that there's an individualism to their action. And thus, instead, Bresson shows us that a person is their action, and that all action is objective. Violence is violence, sin is sin, and with that comes a harsh lens which aims to view things with an objectivity, in the hope of perhaps finding some manner of spiritual neutrality. Bresson's work is incredibly powerful. He deals with themes of ennui in Le Diable Probablement, or the unjust suffering of a child in Mouchette. The tragedy befalling both being that they're so dispassionate in their displays of cruelty. Yet through such a lens is how we understand cruelty within our world. That goodness and evil are not acts that can be rationalised, they're barely acts that can be differentiated. For Bresson shows us a startling world of immense power, of the dispassionate lens of a passive God, present yet silent. Larissa Sheptiko. Sadly, some filmmakers do not have an opportunity to expound on their powerful voice, and such is the case for Soviet filmmaker Larissa Sheptiko. With only the opportunity to make a handful of films before dying in a car crash at the age of 41, Sheptiko carved a language of visual poetry through her poetic symbolism. She uses powerful expressions of the human face addressing the camera, intruding on us, all the while There's a serenity in between moments of harsh violence in which it feels as though the character's spirit for a brief moment escapes from the confines of the frame and drifts, wandering these empty landscapes, even if for a brief respite from the harshness of the real world. Sheptiko spent much of her life suffering, being hospitalized for mental illness, and having a spinal injury whilst in a sanitarium makes it even more beautiful that when watching her work, we see such a lucid language that reaches towards something divine. Sheptiko was able to take the interior and make it exterior, almost orchestrating her sequences with a musicality where all that takes place on screen are the complexities of emotion between individuals as well as between human beings and their landscapes. Sheptiko made films about war, but did not make political work. Whether it was about soldiers captured, threatened with the punishment of death in the ascent, or those struggling with the civilian post-war life in Wings, Sheptiko placed the human being at the forefront and the responsibility we have in retaining our humanity. Victor Rithi. Having made 4 features in 50 years, Victor Rithi has an approach to filmmaking that seems almost wistful, as though he only makes films when there's an urge, a need to make films, which may explain why the human emotion that seeps from these intimate whispers are so strong. Watching Arithi's films is to be caught in a trance, comforted by the silence, submerged into a dreamscape of memory, where what we experience is the weight and immensity of all that's unseen. In Children of the Beehive, it's a child's obsession with death. In El Sur, a child awakens to find her father, an almost psychic figure, has died. These are the landscapes that Arithi traverses, places of longing, of memory. His worlds are deafeningly silent, and any sensations that emerge within them possess the affection of some majestic guardian. A soft breeze blows across a desert, a darkened room illuminated by the flicker of a projector, the warm honey-coloured hues of light shining through stained glass, a child closing her eyes to dream. Arithi is a gentle observer. His work places us softly within these worlds as something empathic. He listens and waits amidst the absence.
Poco a poco fue llegando la noche.
Dust will linger in the air, and a small gesture will feel comforting. Arithi's perspective is one where the past and the present compete for one another in the same space. We linger on the past in some attempt to grasp it where we currently stand, or we tightly hold on to what we have, finding a way to preserve it before it disappears. His documentary, The Quince Tree Son, exemplifies this, following an artist who sees himself as running out of time to paint a simple tree that's growing before it's too late. His process is something delicate. It deals with the pleading for life to just permanently exist in this bittersweet limbo wherein so much meaning emerges from. It's beautiful work from the mind of someone who we only wish could make more. But the truth is that even this is conducive to his work. We can't have everything, and things pass and move on. Sometimes things end, and that is the beauty of it all. Martin Scorsese. He may be the poster for the love of cinema. He's the student and master exemplified in a singular source. Raised on a diet of the great artists, it's hard to imagine Scorsese to have had a life anywhere outside of cinema. As part of the new Hollywood movement, Scorsese emerged onto the scene giving cinema exactly what it needed, a new transgressive language with an absolute understanding of the past. The reality is that as great as Scorsese is, you always get a sense that the act of his movie making is an ode for his love of the form. Every camera move, every music choice feels as though it's some kind of homage, because in many ways they are. It's why I always emphasize people to watch silent cinema, because when you do, you realize that complete ingenuity is impossible. Everything you think is new has been done before, and this seems to be the notion of Scorsese. To take from that encyclopedic knowledge, he fuses what works in legitimately new ways. Scorsese's lens is the hyper-masculine. Worlds of tough men, no-nonsense street guys that, regardless of their ferocity and danger, possess an allure. They have an energy about them which Scorsese is able to put in his films better than anybody. Whether it's Goodfellas, Raging Bull, Killers of the Flower Moon, Scorsese simply knows the best way to convey the energy that a film requires. Bringing Out the Dead is a fever dream nightmare of an ambulance driver, and the way the camera drifts in and out of consciousness is so alien, but it's still Scorsese. It's that same kind of language when Travis stares into his drink in Taxi Driver. It's just what the film needs. Which most of the time is a crescendo. Scorsese takes character narration, whip pans from one scene to the next. It's a kinesis that moves with our subjects throughout a world that feels alive. Although not mood pieces at all, Scorsese's characters are typically inseparable from their environments, and as such, characters find themselves in worlds they mould for themselves. The energy of their surroundings appear symbiotic to them, and as such the camera shadows them. And you'll often find that with this, Scorsese doesn't seek to be bogged down by the other specificities that some filmmakers are concerned with. Continuity editing is not a priority for Scorsese, as this allows him room to experiment within shots. Give actors enough freedom to find that right mood for a sequence, to cut in between and not be concerned about the specifics, but rather the totality of what's going on. Scorsese has had one of, if not the longest career in filmmaking at the level he's at. Bergman, for instance, has eras within his filmmaking, beginning, middle, and late, whereas Scorsese has beginning, middle, late, and very late. He simply has such a repertoire of filmic understanding that making films feels effortless to him. He's the embodiment of all cinema, and his success is indicative of it.
So I was selling them shit. The way I looked at it, their money was better off in my pocket. I knew how to spend it better.
Jean-Pierre Melville. Earlier I mentioned how Fritz Lang was able, through some of his work, to develop the fingerprint for what the thriller genre would later become. However, I would go on to say that Jean-Pierre Melville fully realised the genre and created it as we now know it. Watching a Jean-Pierre Melville film feels as though you're watching a thriller made in the present day. Everything about its pacing, the sleekness of its look. Melville was able to take the ominous ambience of a mystery and establish the filmic language perfect for its presentation. Melville incorporates silence in his work, not out of necessity, rather because it's the most rational soundscape that would exist around his stories. He's very much a show-don't-tell filmmaker. Sequences in which his characters are looking for someone or something, the character quietly darts around looking for details, like eyes scanning a map, a technique that's literally employed in the chase scene of Le Samurai, a sequence so captivating and forward-thinking that it should be foundational study for visual storytelling. And that's what Melville was, a visual storyteller. His shots are wide-open vistas of muted colour palettes, whispered conversations. Just from atmosphere alone, you can tell that you're watching a mystery thriller. Watch the great works of Melville, and you won't even need to look for how well he establishes an atmosphere, the kind of atmosphere that's become inseparable from modern thriller storytelling, when you see cameras slowly creep inwards, when character tension reaches its zenith in silent rooms and vastly important conversations, when no action is occurring, but you know that the next one to be taken is vital, you know you're watching a good thriller. And for that, we can thank Jean-Pierre Melville. Francis Ford Coppola. Another of the fabled movie brats to grace American cinema of the 1970s, Coppola was the more serious companion to Scorsese's kinetic brand of filmmaking. There may be no filmmaker in the world who's had a better single decade than Francis Ford Coppola in the 1970s. 4 films, 2 of which won Best Picture, the other 2 won the Palme d'Or. And the reality is that this is often the nature of examining certain artists' work, because Coppola's masterpieces are so saturated to a single area that the rest of his filmography is almost negligible. Coppola's work is about the inner workings of morally complex individuals. Michael Corleone, Colonel Kurtz, Harry Cole. He seemed intrigued in characters that become slowly devoured by something, whether that thing changed them or made them more of who they've always really been. There's really not much more that can be said about Coppola's golden age of filmmaking. It's a collection of near-perfect films. Every element of them is a collaborative work of multiple masters working at their absolute best. Vittorio Storaro using a changing colour palette for storytelling in Apocalypse Now, perhaps the greatest ensemble cast ever assembled within both Godfather films, and Walter Murch merging editing and sound design for a brand new landscape of narrative possibilities in The Conversation. Coppola's success is a collection of things. It's practically everything we see and hear in this brief period that makes these films as good as they are. You don't need to explain its greatness because it's just brazenly obvious. If filmmakers could choose one era of films to have replicated from another, I think many would pick this short decade of excellence from Francis Ford Coppola.
Send Fredo to pick somebody up at the airport. I'm your older brother, Mike, and I was stepped over. It ain't the way I wanted it.
Agnès Varda. Although making what was arguably the first film of the French New Wave in La Pontchacourt, Agnès Varda was an affiliate of the movement, but not as entrenched within it as those associated with Cahiers du Cinéma. Instead, Varda was considered a left-bank filmmaker within the movement. These were the filmmakers that weren't as cinema-centric within their artistic process. Rather, they saw cinema as equal to the many other arts that they were influenced by. What Varda did bring that distinguished her was a sweetness, a sentimentality. Whether it was in her humanist documentaries or her playfully shot narrative films, Varda expressed this exuberance for the human experience, shooting things with a childlike curiosity. Her voice was so ever-present because the camera feels as though it's a one-to-one replication of her eye.
Encore une main qui filme et l'autre qui est là. Et toujours ces camions. Je voudrais les attraper. Pour retenir ce qui passe? Non, pour jouer.
Varda uses many techniques that are associated with the Nouvelle Vague. Quick jump cuts, splashes of colour, almost a design-like approach to composition. However, the philosophy is entirely different. Varda came from a background in photography and had a fervent passion for all artistic mediums, painting, literature, theatre. When watching The Gleaners and I, this passion expresses itself constantly as Varda jumps between interests of books of her favourite painters, the sculptures of an outsider artist, even the pattern of damp on her ceiling as some kind of organic expression of nature. Varda's lens was one that just saw the best in things. Her filmmaking evokes a sentiment of true happiness and care for others. Her subjects are dignified and respected, from the fictionalized vagrants in Vagabond to the real-life benefactors of the actors of her first film in The Beaches of Agnes.
Ils connaissaient des photos de leur père, mais ils ne l'avaient jamais vu en mouvement.
But returning to her aesthetic style, it was not like that of Godard, which was about the snappiness of things. Varda has a keen aesthetic eye, and what she looks for is beauty in all angles. You never quite know how Varda will shoot a sequence, but she seems to always manage to arrange her framing and colour to create something legitimately beautiful. Varda embodies joie de vivre, which makes her filmography even more astounding to know that she did tackle many serious, sometimes even horrific subject matter, and did so with astounding dexterity. Because of her early arrival on the film scene, Varda has the reputation as one of the great female filmmakers, but I don't think that does her justice. She is in fact one of the great filmmakers. Steven Spielberg. I mean, is there a name more associated with the role of a director? He's the filmmaker that someone who knows nothing about film names as a filmmaker. And it's not because he makes the biggest films of all time, although he's made some of them, or that he's the most artistic voice of his generation. It's because Spielberg possesses a kind of golden ratio of film, a kind of comprehensive understanding of the masters, a humanism of the great voices of cinema, and the same joy and wonder that we see at the genesis with Melies. The truth about Spielberg is that many dismiss his work as purely entertainment but without any kind of artistic edge. For one, I don't necessarily believe entertainment to be a downfall of art, but this also wouldn't be exactly true. When we go back a generation and view the works of Hitchcock, Kurosawa, Ford, and many others, there's a very salient line between their work and the work of Spielberg. If anything, Spielberg may be an even more accessible version of a Hitchcock, in that every visible aspect of filmmaking is on display in his work. His films are like lessons on how to make a film. When I think of a Spielberg image, I think of large crowds of people moving to and fro, filling the screen with energy, but it's all so masterfully composed. Another of the movie brats, he doesn't do a Scorsese where large arrays of people add a chaotic dynamism. Spielberg's is ordered. Their movements are completely composed with cameras swooping in and out of characters. Character action carefully coordinated so that action is able to display their personality. If multiple characters are in the vicinity of one another, watch how Spielberg directs them with subtle interactions to show their relationships. Spielberg is a master at making exposition interesting by filling necessary dumps of information with visual interest. People can say what they want about the depth of his work, but you can never say that he isn't adept at crafting an image. And truth be told, most of Spielberg's works are also like odes to cinema. We get lost in the almost operatic heights of E.T., the awe of discovering a new world in Jurassic Park. Spielberg is a sensorial filmmaker. He wants his audience to feel amazed by cinema the same way that he was as a child, for us to feel about the form the same way that he did. Because film is a language that speaks to us in ways that feel larger than our real life, and Spielberg's absolute mastery of the foundations of film is deserving of our respect. Because how could it not? It makes us feel too much. Rainer Werner Fassbinder. Fassbinder is in contention for the most prolific of the master filmmakers, rivaling even the output of John Ford. In a career spanning just over 10 years, Fassbinder made over 30 films, and these weren't films that had a methodology of how to get them completed and out there. Fassbinder's cinema is jagged, theatrical, and drenched in violent fusions of cruelty and tenderness. Fassbinder truly evokes the sentiment that an artist should make what they want. He tore through genres, in one moment making melodramas, then making hyper-coloured erotic thrillers, and before you knew it he was delving into sci-fi dystopias. And no topic was too taboo for Fassbinder, becoming a controversial figure because his individualist approach satisfied no one. Fassbinder deals with capitalism, homosexuality, Nazism, and would receive opposition from many simply because he explored these ideas through some of the most uncomfortable lenses, even willing to speak out against the things he believed and upholding the ideas he rejected. Because Fassbinder's films are about power, whether it be between lovers, allies, or enemies. Characters yearn for submission, love becomes a defiant act. There's a tragic and beautifying aspect to how Fassbinder portrays the human condition, always transgressing it to its most profane, yet admiring it, as though passion is the thing that beautifies all humans. Fassbinder's cinema is not a pure cinema, it's a gritty and uncomfortable cinema. He sought to explore the realities of daily prejudices and how the human being is ripe for exploitation. His style was that somewhere in the middle of a Bresson, an Ozu, a Pasolini, and even a Kubrick. It's something completely unique. His films don't feel like surgical slices though, they feel like blunt hammers, awkwardly smashing their way through any kind of idealistic vision of the world. Fassbinder's life was his art, and that fury, that excess that was able to reveal such a truth came from a man that was also determined to live on the edge and provoke a society that he was unwilling to offer any soothing comfort towards. His cinema comes with a rage, yet a rage that reminds us that love is but a step away from cruelty, and one could not exist without the other.
Nix verstehen, neidisch.
Neidisch ist, wenn jemand nicht sehen kann, dass ein anderer was hat.
Ah, verstehen.
Robert Altman. There was a new breath of life given to cinema in the work of Robert Altman, and I mean that in almost a literal sense. What Altman brought to cinema was a new way to capture life. We may talk of the influence of several filmmakers on those that would come to be, but Altman preceded the hyper-edited, quick-pacing postmodern structure that would come to full fruition in the 1990s. Altman made films about worlds. It was ensemble casts where the story was that life ensued and unfolded in front of us. Altman would allow extras to speak on set, actors to talk over one another. There's an authenticity when you see a concert take place in a Robert Altman film because a concert was taking place and a film just managed to get made within it. Go and listen to some of the soundscapes of an Altman film, and sometimes it gets so extreme that you're like, what's going on? He used to place microphones on other actors so that he could layer these different areas of sound to create this ambiance of an entire world space that stretches beyond the frames of the film. And when you see how his films are constructed, they're made of nothing but arrays of people, and we capture vignettes of what they're doing, and we cut back and forth between their stories. Many are left unresolved. We'll see a side character that appears for a single scene and then disappears. It's just a collage of some mood of a time and an attempt to capture that in a bottle. And he does.
But we didn't see the guy. No, we didn't see the guy. Was she chasing her, or she chasing him at all? Was he call, or
There really is this strong ability to craft an entire way of existence with Altman's work. I'm describing it as if there's an urgency, but when you watch it, it all feels so casual. Everything just blends together to make these amazing mood pieces. He shot almost exclusively in wide shots, and every frame of his has so much going on in it that there is no focus to it. The whole chaotic manner of existence is the meaning. There's very few films that stand out as having as unique an approach to transgressing the standard form of filmmaking, but there are even fewer that succeeded as well as Altman did.
Yes, sir. I guess I better call Major Burns and tell him to put another couple of surgeons over from the day shift out of the night shift. I'll put in a call into General Hammond and Saul. I hope he sends us those two surgeons.
Ken Loach. Kitchen sink realism emerged in post-war Britain and was the British answer to Italian neorealism. Dealing with themes of cultural disillusionment after World War II, the lens moved from broader ranges into the domestic hardships of everyday people. The movement has been influential throughout all of British cinema to this day, with one of its strongest voices emerging in Ken Loach. Loach's films are, in their purest form, about people. People from strong working class cultures who speak with thick working class accents, whose problems are vastly political but shown through a lens of the personal.
You need to leave the building. Sorry, look.
This is ridiculous.
Jesus Christ! Who's first in this queue? I am. Do you mind if this young lass signs on first? No, you carry on. There you go. Now you can go back to your desk and let her sign on and do the job that the taxpayer pays you for.
Loach's characters are often suffering through poverty. There's no system in place for their voices to be heard, and they're typically shown in a kind of limbo state, with no possibility to ascend through the ranks of society, trying their hardest only to be stuck at the bottom rungs of the ladder. Although Loach's films may come through a very political lens, it's hard to deny the passion which he feels for human justice. Whether it's a struggling mother at a food bank or a postman down on his luck, there's always a heart-wrenching view towards the humanity of people, that no matter who we are and where we come from, we should all be treated with dignity. And this is the message that Ken Loach's work ultimately leaves us with.
You've got to feed them when they're hungry, see. You can only do it when they're at feeding time, like, sir. Yeah? You've got to use jesses on, sir, all the time.
These what?
Jesses, sir.
Eric Rohmer. The final of our Nouvelle Vague associates, Rohmer was the most observant of the New Wave filmmakers. His style of cinema was one that dealt in conversations, modes of transition. In a sense, more than perhaps any other filmmaker mentioned here, his films really are not about anything. They unfold on sunny beaches and along serene country roads plastered with triadic colour. This was a far stretch away from the pop-infused worlds of Godard's vision of a post-war France. This was a vision almost returning to the past, of that impressionistic countryside idealism present in the 19th century. Rohmer seeks to find the drama in being human, not in action. There's no moment in a Rohmer film which supersedes any other. We simply watch as we're carried through conversations about life as the day fades into the afternoon.
Tu vois, j'ai envie d'aller à Ouessant. J'ai envie de partir quelques jours, de prendre l'air, de quitter ce restaurant, de passer quelques journées entières avec toi, même si c'est risqué.
The ordinariness of Rohmer's images must not be confused with the mundane. However, this would be difficult to argue upon seeing his work, because what you have is an almost exceedingly satisfying vista where oceans break towards the horizons, and in the midst of it, characters just speak. They discuss their ideologies, their pulls between personal want and a grander responsibility, and Rohmer discovers in this milieu of the ordinary a deep passion for all aspects of living. Nothing matters in a Rohmer film because everything matters. Every minute reaction to a person's confession, every slight hesitation and contradiction in a human being, they're all laid in front of us in a rather cathartic way of viewing the serenity of life by making its greatest complexities appear all the more universal and all the more simple.
D'accord. Speak French, so.
Ouais. Qu'est-ce que je vais parler
Je
maintenant?
sais pas. Ce que vous voulez.
Alors, mais qu'est-ce que vous faites normalement? Vous suivez les copains? Ou on peut y aller à l'ancienne?
Moi, je connais personne.
Chantal Akerman. And here we view the exact opposite. A lens wherein the mundanity and simplicities of life are transgressed into vast complexities of recontextualized action. Akerman is closer to making video art than making traditional cinema. Her filmmaking is about confronting us with the daily mundanity of real life, where nothing happens. A woman cooks, another organises her furniture, another waits for a train to arrive, and in the midst of this lack of meaning, Ackerman adjusts her gaze and lends us a hyper-focus on the inane. In turn, actions that were once ignored become unignorable. They become something other. Why must we watch this for so long? Why is there such an insistence on focusing on the meaningless? Why are these human behaviours delivering such discomfort? Spaces once denoted to domestic life become claustrophobic. If Varda denoted the love of life, then Ackerman's lens treats life like a prison, an unescapable slow death where the only way out is through violent release, through a complete upheaval of the way we believe life is supposed to be. The audience for Ackerman become voyeurs, silent observers that must acknowledge that some of the great truths of life lie unexposed to the world, and Ackerman exposes them to sunlight, and in doing so, those great secrets turn to shame. Some films are not enjoyable to watch, and this could easily be said about Ackerman, but they are necessary. Andrei Tarkovsky. The silence imbues the fog-covered landscapes. Figures trapped in time stand almost catatonic within them, as a dripping of water can be heard falling from a relic of the past. This is where we will find ourselves when alongside Andrei Tarkovsky. Making only 7 films, but with a style so strong, fewer filmmakers seem to hold such conviction in their belief and methodology as he did, gifting us a filmography of the most transcendental kind. Time in Tarkovsky's films is unlike anything else. We're forced to experience its saturated nature, with long takes that drift beyond our characters, like the film is falling into some kind of daydream, or that we're ongoing a kind of out-of-body experience, that the landscape of the film's narrative is taking place here, on the ethereal and spiritual realm. Tarkovsky was a devoted Orthodox Christian, which, like other filmmakers we've mentioned, is something inseparable from his work. He wrote in his seminal writing, Sculpting in Time, that he thought of the artistic process as akin to prayer, and when at the finale of Andrei Rublev, we're confronted with the awe-inspiring prostration towards the icon paintings of his eponymous subject, it's a process that does not hide itself. Tarkovsky seemed to find serenity in nature as some manner of creation we find ourselves in, like a subject becoming aware it finds itself in a painting. Often the literal landscape appears alien, yet Tarkovsky imbues his work with such texture that it feels material. The crackling of aged books, overgrown grass amidst rusted railways, the age and decay of a world offering some transient beauty. Because there is an intrinsic sense of nostalgia within Tarkovsky's work. In his film, Nostalgia, we see his longing for artists and a mode of being which he had no first-hand experience with, yet the desire to have that within oneself. And Tarkovsky expresses the self as a spiritual being. The landscape of dreams and desire are one and the same. We exist alongside a world that's elemental. Fires billow, and his lens towards the growth of a tree or the swaying of a plant can only be examined through a lens of amazement. Tarkovsky frequently takes aside moments to bask in the sheer astonishment of nature. When watching a Tarkovsky film, you'll find yourself almost trapped, almost forced to address the present transience of our experience. Tarkovsky doesn't edit his sequences. Many of them play out in real time, or some warped version of real time that makes our experience so much more different when compared to watching other films. He said of his own process that his editing was about editing blocks of time, not continuity, not montage theory. For him, it was about an atmosphere that only reveals itself over an elongated period, and Tarkovsky takes these feelings of a shot and organises them alongside one another. This was Tarkovsky's approach. He wasn't making films to be intellectualised, he was embodying a spiritual form of cinema that was to communicate things about our ancestry, about fleeting death, about humility within the vast cosmos. He found animals to have a spiritual nature about them and often let his camera rest on them, because with animals comes a purity, a lack of knowledge of good and evil. And this is Tarkovsky. They're not moral forms of cinema. They aim to take us to another realm that we can't even explain. And truthfully, he does. Tarkovsky developed one of the most beautiful and celestial forms of filmmaking, and in just a matter of a small amount of films, became a filmmaker of incredible influence, but more importantly, an artist that managed to take us far beyond our human capacity. Werner Herzog. His role is to play the voice of God, and what a strange God he is. Whether he is traversing the devouring soul of mankind through the jungle, interviewing real-life death row inmates, or the absurdist view of a drug-addicted police officer, it is a peculiar perspective of the human being that Werner Herzog possesses.
I want the opera house. I want my opera house! I want the opera house! This church remains closed till this town has its opera house!
A lot of people admire Herzog for his weirdness, which it is. Few filmmakers could have worked with Klaus Kinski, never mind having several collaborations with him that have gone down in infamy as some of the most insane stories about the making of a film. But Herzog's cinema is a kind of madness. It's about men approaching volcanoes. It's about evil arriving in a town to poison it. It's about unquenchable ambition. It's about those that have no place within society, even if that means that they must carve their own to exist. Herzog is a filmmaker of great breadth. His work as a documentarian is as important as his fictional work, and yet we never know exactly through what lens he will view the world. But there is always a thread of Herzog peering into the unknowable and finding himself amidst a nature which he finds to be inherently violent. Herzog possesses a rather objective lens when examining the world, in that there often is no great mystery to the things we see. There is no subtext. In his words, a man is a man as much as a chair is a chair. It cannot be anything else. Which makes it fascinating to him to often view such subjects which have immense depth, and the result is this kind of empty poetry, where his fascination lies in the ruin of man without ever losing respect for the dignity of him. His world is one where reason and madness do not differ all that greatly from one another, and that man is a confused creature in an incredibly indifferent world.
And what haunts me is that in all the faces of all the bears that Treadwell ever filmed, I discover no kinship, no understanding, no mercy. I see only the overwhelming indifference of nature.
Shohei Imamura. After Japan's golden age, we can rarely view how filmmakers that followed aimed to transgress the form. Perhaps the zenith of this new era of filmmaking can be found in Shohei Imamura. Imamura actually began his filmmaking career working as an assistant to Ozu on his films. This seemed to have a profound effect on him, as he would then proceed to make films almost as an abject rejection to the kind of cinema Ozu made about Japan. He worked initially as a studio director, but sought to gain his own voice, and upon embracing an independent approach to filmmaking, his subversive style completely saturated his work. Imamura was transgressive in the sense that contradiction and juxtaposition was to reveal new lenses for cinema. Comedy was fused with disgust, filmed in documentary realism. Brutal tales of survival become ones of deep compassion. although in general, compassion was not at the forefront for Imamura. He was no Ozu. For Imamura, humans are about the flesh. They are chaotic beings driven by yearning for power by any means. To watch an Imamura film is to be thrown into the swamp of the human condition. Imamura was, as he stated, interested in the lower half of the human body. He followed serial killers, those abandoned by society, and yet I must say that although there is a lack of glamour in his work, that it appears messy and deals with the primal nature of mankind, there is a kind of grace within it. There's a kind of transcendental thread that I see in Imamura's work, that when these acts occur, they almost occur in strong silences, that his depiction of Japanese life was not orderly, but there was something restless about it, as if in those serene, orderly frameworks must exist people who refuse to abide by it. Michael Haneke. The ultimate balance of formalism and postmodernism, Haneke presents us with a dispassionate lens to observe a violently sterile view of the modern era. Haneke's films are for many difficult to watch. The world he portrays has an uncomfortable violence to it, as something that explodes out of what are seemingly normal everyday lives. However, to Haneke, the normal everyday life is anything but.
Feigling.
Haneke's aesthetic is similar to Bresson's, close-ups of body parts that separate the human being from the action, putting them in an almost mechanized state, the solemnity of many of our subjects. However, Haneke's films are more realistic than Bresson's. As a matter of fact, you can argue that Haneke deals with a hyper-realistic aesthetic in all facets. His attention to detail is unlike any filmmaker's attempts at capturing the current era, and what he seeks to do is to diagnose the dehumanization that occurs in day-to-day lives. Haneke often deals with the middle-class bourgeois, those whose lives are not wanting for anything. The segments of society that pique his interest are the affluent, television presenters, classical musicians, socialites, professors, and it's the minutiae of their resignation to a life of modernity that causes immense anguish. A family becomes distraught at the lack of meaning in middle-class consumerism. A man who reaps the benefits of an affluent lifestyle is all of a sudden watched by an unknown voyeur. And this also brings us to the crux of Haneke's lens, that other notion of hyperrealism. Haneke portrays the ideas of modern communication to be something fragmented. He's drawn to the varying forms of surrogate communication, screens, games, sign language, television, layers upon layers of subverted meaning that seem to distract human beings from their innate condition. When you watch a Haneke film, you're pulled into a world which is all too recognizable, but by his objective camera lingering, cutting to black, just showing things as they ought to be shown, that same world becomes so repellent. Haneke's work does not glamorize, doesn't intrude on the truth of when and how we live. His filmography is a powerful example of discontent with many aspects of the modern world. Yet what separates him most is his eye, the manner in which he's able to comprehend postmodernity better than arguably any other filmmaker and still deliver it through the formalist method of filmmaking. Static cameras, dispassionate, and perhaps most distinguishable, incredibly serious. Paul Thomas Anderson. If the movie brats were the sequel to the Golden Age, then the ilk of filmmakers like Paul Thomas Anderson continue that trend of ongoing influence, just as the filmmakers of now and onward are most likely influenced by this new school. The earliest works of Paul Thomas Anderson are most evidently influenced by the 1970s era of American cinema, particularly when compared to the work of Robert Altman and Martin Scorsese, to the point that techniques can be straight lifted from their work and seen in Anderson's, such as the whip-pan transition of Scorsese's fast-paced sequences. And Altman's ensemble style is immediately recognisable in works like Magnolia and Boogie Nights. However, this isn't to diminish the work of Anderson, as these works are fantastic in and of themselves, but it must be said that over time, his lens matured and his own voice developed.
I have a competition in me. I want no one else to succeed. I hate most people.
Anderson's framework became one of a unique kind of mastery. He began crafting deep character studies, and it seemed as though his viewpoint expanded in scope. Whereas his earlier work deals with familial bonds, relationships between people, his later work explored a richness of themes, quests for absolute power, religious indoctrination, love on a more primal level. However, he never lost that charm of his earlier work and manages to infuse those techniques alongside these more fleshed out thematics. For me, Anderson is one of those pure filmmakers that exist today. His understanding of when the camera needs to be made salient and when it doesn't possesses such an acute understanding of the form that those are the kind of things that you look for and say, this is a guy that gets it. Composition is not what Anderson's known for, and yet when we establish characters in a new area, or when they confront one another, those simple rules of composition and camera positioning display such a fundamental understanding of the form within what are essentially incredibly forward-thinking postmodern works. This is one of the common threads of many of the filmmakers of this era, that their perspective is brand new, and yet they've mastered what the previous masters already had established for us. In musical collaboration, in screenwriting, in character building, Anderson displays mastery in spades.
It's no business of ours what Mrs. Rose decides to do with her life. But she can no longer behave like this and be dressed by the House of Woodcock.
Spike Lee. Spike Lee signs off all of his films, but not in the way that Abel Gance did. Lee does it in a simpler way. He calls his films a Spike Lee joint and ends with saying, "You dig?" Because Spike Lee has a rebellious twang to his filmmaking, but not necessarily one that feels overtly aggressive or even as political as many other filmmakers here, even though the majority of his signature work can only be viewed through a racial lens. Lee's work is alive. His techniques often simulate that same kind of street aesthetic embodied in the counterculture of the 80s and 90s. The camera is canted, handheld, and characters confront the audience just as the film itself confronts us.
Hold up! Time out! Time out! Y'all take a chill. You need to cool that shit out, and that's the double truth.
Lee's filmmaking is something transformative. It was a new lens of transgression for what film could be, and personified the nature of how this new era of film had the capacity to inhabit so much, to be all at once satire and serious, dramatic and comedic. All things bleed together in a Spike Lee joint. There's a burning fire to make films that show you not what you believe the world to be, but what you know it to be, and you have to show it all. And as an addendum to this, there are those who would not watch Spike Lee's work simply because it's viewed through a racial lens, and I bring that up now because there will have been many, I'm sure of it, that will also not like the fact that many filmmakers I've also mentioned thus far are inseparable from, say, a religious lens. To those people, I say, if you're willing to convince yourself and others that the work of a Tarkovsky is to be separated from his religious worldview, then you would also have to say Spike Lee should not be viewed through his racial lens. It's not important. Obviously, we see how foolish that sounds, and so this is just a reminder that filmmakers come with perspectives you may agree or disagree with. However, what is important is their mastery of form. Spike Lee came with a brave and unique new language at a time when the horizons for filmmaking possibilities exploded, and to still emerge from that milieu with a standalone voice, then you must have created something very special.
I thought you were smart. But you just another one of those cats strutting down the avenue in your clown suit with all that mess on you, looking like a monkey. The white man sees you and laughs. He laughs because he knows you ain't white. Man, who are you? No, the question is, who are you?
Abbas Kiarostami. What is cinema reduced beyond its simplest form? If we keep falling on the premise that narrative and character are what most films ought to be, then what do we say of films that choose to remove that for even less? This is what we see in the work of Abbas Kiarostami, a filmmaker whose work is built around the absence of things, where elliptical forms of filmmaking are imposed to take things away from the image, leaving us in a state of longing. Like many of the great Iranian filmmakers, Kiarostami evokes a sense of poetry to his image that intermingle with the simplicity of life. A car travels along a road, a can rolls down a hill, trees sway in the breeze. These are the things our attention is directed towards, rather than the high drama which may be occurring just off screen. When I see a Kiarostami film, I find it comes with a sense of realism that's all its own, as if he wanted to uncover a kind of fictionalized realism. Conversations are half heard, stories are left open to possibility. He imposes as much of the real-life spontaneity and randomness of things into the framework of a film. What we're left with in this cinema of omission are grand meditations on time and being. A Kiarostami film is an intimate observation on the fragility of the human soul, displayed in the most delicate manner. We hover along landscapes with such patience, because in a Kiarostami film, we don't need to go anywhere. Everything that the film needs to say is right here in front of us. There'll be no great revelations, no awe-inspiring spectacle. He made fiction films, documentaries, but most were hybrids in between, as though neither complete fiction nor non-fiction was sufficient to fully weigh on the human condition. And if you want to prepare for Kiarostami's perspective and what exactly his focus often falls towards, then look at his final film, 24 frames. 24 frames of animals in nature. This is his lens. Life in motion. And that is enough. David Cronenberg. If body horror were to be personified in a single filmmaker, it would unquestionably be David Cronenberg as its representative. You don't have to delve deeply into Cronenberg's filmography to see where his interest lies. Cronenberg's philosophy is centered around the human body and tests to see where the limits of it can be stretched to, metaphorically and literally. We have a perception of how a violent act is to play out in cinema, yet when that same act emerges in a Cronenberg film, it seems almost excessive. And yet the reality is that that gruesomeness is what's actually missing from most other cinema. If we are to find catharsis in violence, shouldn't we at least be honest about it? Cronenberg portrays the desires of the human flesh, the need to be stronger, to be more than what we are, and show the consequences of what that would mean.
Got pretty good at it, haven't I? Yeah, it's almost second nature. Stop biting my nails.
What does it mean to separate from our own body in some macabre fetishization to these new technological intertwines of sexual desire, as we see in films like Videodrome and Crash? The difference is that although Cronenberg is an incredibly philosophical filmmaker when it comes to our relationship with the human body amidst rapidly changing social landscapes, Cronenberg shows it in its most extreme form, Bodies that transform, that ooze with pus, wounds that make flesh unrecognisable. Cronenberg's perspective is that of an absolute materialist. If we separate ourselves from what we are at the most base level, where does it place us? Is it possible to dehumanize ourselves past the point of recognition, to feel utter disgust at the acts that we perform? Cronenberg's cinema is a cinema of the flesh, not one that celebrates its indulgences, but one that warns of the declining slope that causes us to stumble into the abyss of our own desires. David Lynch. A filmmaker's greatest attribute might be to establish a unique voice, a voice so powerful and so identifiable that you've essentially trademarked the act of being you. This is what we get with David Lynch. Some may call his work surreal, some may call it weird, but you cannot deny that Lynch's work is memorable. With films of nightmarish characters plucked from our subconscious, settings of the absolute innocuous turned into something uncanny, darkened hallways, strange voiced men, stilted dialogue, an unmatched atmosphere to unsettle and disconcert, the work of David Lynch can look opaque or even meaningless to the layman, but I argue that to understand Lynch's work is one of the simplest tasks you can do. And I say this as Lynch, more than most filmmakers here, has been very candid about his artistic approach, just perhaps less open regarding the specificity of his work. Lynch works from his subconscious. We all have one. Imagine you were to take your deepest dreams, those that feel so real and impactful to you, and just show them on screen. In its simplest form, this is the world that we inhabit in a David Lynch film. It's not a film based on dream logic. It is dream logic. There are truths in our subconscious that don't have a one-to-one translation in the waking world, yet they linger with us, and we don't disregard them. The same can be said of Lynch's work. A man in a darkened room inhales an unknown substance before collapsing in a sexual frenzy. A man smiles at a dinner table while a girl behind him cries, and it goes on and on. There's so much to say about Lynch's work, yet so little to explain. Every technique he employs, if just accepted without intellectualizing, can be understood with such clarity. If anything, they are experiential sensorial works. What they make you feel is what the film is about. This sequence of a telephone ringing in a not completely dark room as a low frequency hum can subtly be heard and the red wall fades into an unseen abyss. Surely the atmosphere that clearly pervades the scene is enough to tell you what it's about. But then we ask, well, what about those other facets of Lynch? The non-nightmarish ones, the strangeness of a Twin Peaks, or the obsession with Americana? Well, it's because Lynch has no cynicism in his work. Some will often try to relay the idea that characters speak a certain way with Lynch because it's a commentary, but the fact of the matter is, Lynch's filmmaking is one of the most sincere you can experience. When the sun shines and Angelo Badalamenti's score rings like an angelic chorus, it's because Lynch likes the idea that we can look at the world through this lens also. And so, the same approach is applied when watching. Just look at what you're seeing, and it should be very obvious to you. What you see is what you get. Lynch trusts his instinct when it comes to filmmaking. There's a truth within him that he feels and has meditated on long enough that he knows it to be true. And rather than thinking and explaining what that means or what it signifies, sometimes the best thing to do is to put it out there as your truth. And hopefully, it will be someone else's.
Ask me.
How'd you get inside my house?
You invited me. It is not my custom to go where I'm not wanted.
Krzysztof Kieślowski. If Lynch's work is about creating art through the narrative of the subconscious, then Kieślowski's filmmaking is set on a purely emotional landscape. Kieślowski's films are almost saint-like, in that they act as quiet whispers of immensely important codes for the human condition. Kieślowski talks to us about mortality, love, the human spirit, the binding moral forces that connect us all, and delivers it to us in such a profoundly beautified aesthetic that asks us, what kind of world are we looking at? How is it that by such a subtle change in our perspective, the world can look so pleasing to us, regardless of what goes on within it? Kieślowski was a director where the total aesthetic was symbiotic to his filmmaking process. Many of his finished and unfinished works were attempts at creating parallels to structures within art and the story of humanity, artistic triptychs, retelling the Ten Commandments, an unfinished project of the Divine Comedy. And with this, the visual telling of each was approached with the sentimentality that was necessary. Kieślowski shoots through panes of glass, through reflections in the water. He uses silhouettes, old lenses, colour filters. He reminds us that film is a language, which is not only philosophical, but also has the potential to make us feel through its abstraction. And it's in those abstractions where its greatest poetry will emerge. Kieślowski was able to capture the divinity of life, to take the humble and make it operatic, to take the human being and show that within them lies something vast and eternal. Hayao Miyazaki. If he's not the greatest animator, then who is? Whether we measure him by his dexterity, his creativity, his humanism, many of us wish to have what seems to exist in excess in Miyazaki. A similarly Kubrickian approach to animation, Miyazaki's method is one of complete control, his films often taking several years to complete and almost utterly disregarding the industry standard approach to animation that exists in Japan. The fact is, there is no one like Miyazaki. Famous for his almost nonchalant pessimistic philosophy, the one thing that this never touched was his art. Miyazaki's animations take the most beautiful aspects of life and cast them into the most beautifully rendered animations you've ever seen. Animation has far too often been disregarded as a children's medium, and the reality is that Miyazaki actually leans into that. He feels that children are the only ones who fully understand his work. There's a purity with his perspective. Not that all children are good or moral, he often shows that children can be petulant and selfish, but that they are the purest humans. They own their flaws, and everything that they experience is so vast. It's as though they have an ocean of experience at every small detail of life. Because Miyazaki has this balance of the macro and microcosms of life, where in one moment we see the personification of many great spirits battling against us, he then allows us time to meditate, to simply sit and acknowledge where we are and what we are. So much detail is spent within Miyazaki of those tender moments with people, small unravelings of a treat, the organisation of your things, the little moments that add to the humanity of a person. Because we are just beings going about our business, and it's often not the cataclysms of life where this is displayed, it's in those intimate moments. The hug of a person, the grasping of a hand. In these moments, we have no agenda, we have no intent, other than getting through our life and seeing what comes next. And Miyazaki displays that life will have infinite things to throw our way, but although its landscape is confusing and chaotic, it's more often than not something to be mesmerised by. That there will always be a sun-soaked grassy hill under a pure blue sky, that love and family and goodness will reign supreme, and that these worlds are real, that imagination and quietude are one in the same, and life is nothing more than our own journeys through both. Lars von Trier. His collaboration with Thomas Vinterberg to establish the Dogma 95 movement may not only be the most common act attributed to Lars von Trier, it's also most telling of his approach to the medium of film. Dogma 95 was a way to re-envision the standards of film. It encouraged no diegetic music. Films had to be shot on handheld and on location, not in a studio. And although only a handful of true Dogma films were made, it's that ethos to turn cinema on its head that stayed with von Trier, even after the movement had run its course. There's a jokester within von Trier, even though he makes sincere work, that film should always aim to provoke.
Perhaps according to a religion that doesn't exist yet. According to a God that hasn't yet manifested himself.
But then you can imagine anything.
Von Trier has made work which has been censored, caused mass walkouts, even commented on his own work in ways that got him banned from the Cannes Film Festival. But being a persona non grata is where von Trier revels best, because his work is all about the discomfort of all things, exposing the artifice of film by showing us the camera, making the film's perspective expound on some of the most controversial ideas a filmmaker could explore, exploiting the slave trade to sensationalize, empathizing with a serial killer, accepting the meaninglessness in the end of the world. I don't believe that von Trier falls into the category of many of the humanist filmmakers, but I also don't think he's necessarily misanthropic either. Von Trier's is a cinema of friction, a need to contradict social norms in all their facets, whether that means that the film form itself must be completely altered, or that the societal truths must be overhauled. That is the kind of film von Trier wants to make. A von Trier film will deliver itself in chapters, closer to a novel. It will be shot in a realist sense to evoke improvisation, and then present tableaus in the exact opposite style. That is von Trier, the disagreeable aspects of man. That truth must come in counterbalance, that whatever is accepted must be the opposite, and that there is always space for the profane.
Chaos reigns.
Edward Yang. Through the 80s and 90s, Taiwanese cinema went under a resurgence, with a group of filmmakers working to give Taiwanese film a true identity. The movement is known as Taiwan New Cinema, and it gave to us other master filmmakers, such as Ho Xiaoshen. However, our focus right now is filmmaker Edward Yang. Edward Yang embodied what Taiwan New Cinema was. Stories about Taiwanese families, emphasizing the internal world and the deep emotions that emerge in daily life, all displayed through a bittersweet and incredibly strong visual aesthetic. Few works can match the simple human depth of Edward Yang's work, as we gaze at people basking in the quietude of life enacting itself upon them. They reflect, they feel, and the world around them echoes their sentiment. As the sounds of a distant city hums in the background, you sit in the fluorescent light of a building while outside is still. You remember your life and think on your memories as the world around you changes. We see life enact itself across varying generations and see the beauty of how things change, as well as feel the sorrow of all that's been forgotten. Yang evokes all of this through his still manner of filmmaking. To sit and watch as the beauty of human emotion reveals itself in its most tender renditions. Theo Angelopoulos. When we slow down the pace of cinema, sometimes it feels intimate. However, with other filmmakers, it feels monumental. This is the case for Theo Angelopoulos. The films of Angelopoulos feel as though they're shrouded in history, as we watch cameras drift across endless terrains as the strange figures within them become shrouded by mist. Shots in Angelopoulos films feel long, as in many instances we drift in and out of time within them. We fade through temporal blocks without ever explaining the reasoning behind it, and then find ourselves in almost surreal landscapes. Many of the interjections from Angelopoulos are moments in which the audience is literally supposed to reflect on what's just occurred. The great sense of longing, how atmosphere and nature seem to bring with it a shared and connected sense of humanity. As the fog rolls in, as the snow falls, as the people stop and stare, it's as though the world reflects the spirit of humanity, and that from nowhere at all are we all of a sudden overcome with emotion and memory. Atmosphere is what burns slowly in the work of Angelopoulos, that it's in that feeling of a space and time where we'll find the most truth. Angelopoulos' meditative gaze ensures us that the past never leaves us, that everywhere we go, we'll feel its immense weight dispersed amongst the quiet whispers of a deafening silence that surrounds us. David Fincher. The obvious benchmark of the thriller genre whose line moves through Jean-Pierre Melville undeniably also passes through David Fincher. Fincher has set the blueprint for what the modern-day thriller looks like. His mastery of the technicalities of cinema have granted him the ability of complete control over all his images. A Fincher film doesn't really have flaws in the image. Everything looks as it's supposed to look. There's a clarity, almost clinical precision, with how the mise-en-scène interplays with each other.
They're just down in the basement. Not many people have basements in California.
I do.
Fincher is known as a perfectionist, but not at the almost obsessive level that Kubrick was. He's a filmmaker that knows exactly what he wants, doesn't need to discover where the film is going. He researches and plans ahead extensively, and it's hard not to see. Fincher is a director that places the camera on a tripod and shoots. But the few instances that the camera does move, you notice it. The camera moves alongside people, it shows internal shifts, and he's even willing to take it to its most extreme edges. It's a style that carries him through all of his work, including dialogue-heavy dramas like The Social Network. But when we think of what matches the style of Fincher, it's undeniably films with a sinister edge. Things that require that precision, where the camera perfectly glides over to where it needs to be, and when looking at a wide shot or a master, it's shot with such clarity, as though everything you could look for is right in front of you. You can examine the frame to your heart's extent, but everything appears in its right place. Fincher is a filmmaker vastly intrigued in the macabre, killers, weirdos, the fringes, and their portrayals are considered so authentic, so uncomfortably close to our own world, precisely because of Fincher's complete efficiency at capturing the world as he wants it to be captured.
I picture cracking her lovely skull, unspooling her brains, trying to get answers. The primal questions of any marriage.
Peter Greenaway. We may not come across a filmmaker on this list, or anywhere else, that you could put forth an argument that they may in fact despise cinema. Although if there were a case for anyone, I would attribute it to Peter Greenaway. Greenaway is unlike any other filmmaker we've mentioned, because his films are the least cinematic in every conceivable way. Peter Greenaway trained as a painter before he became a filmmaker, and across all of his filmography, you'd have to say that to pick a word to describe his work, it would be painterly. If not that, then perhaps theatrical, some other medium outside of cinematic. Greenaway structures his films through tableaus. He may use chapters of the film segmented as books, or days for a tasting menu. He's never one to shy away from altering the narrative expectations of cinema to lean more towards other visual and non-visual mediums. The irony being that in this deconstruction of cinema, Greenaway's work results in some of the most impactful of the medium.
I'll give it a best. Education, I'll tell you what it's like.
His content is often shocking or extreme, but the dichotomy is that it's presented in the most ostentatious of fashions to beautify it. His collaborations for set design, costume and cinematography are very often collaborations with some of the greatest, most talented individuals of those fields, using Jean-Paul Gaultier to make the costumes, Sasha Vieni as cinematographer, and of course his long-time collaboration with musician Michael Nyman that makes fully realised scores that are as important as the visual element. Greenaway is a filmmaker about reimagining the very idea of what cinema is supposed to represent. His stories march forward in ways we're not familiar with seeing through cinema, and whether the purpose is to utterly destroy the form or offer a new perspective on its very welcome artifice is up for debate. But Greenaway has become a far too overlooked filmmaker for making truly innovative work unlike anyone else. He's like a more clinical Von Trier or a less cinematically inclined Kubrick. Ultimately, he's like a master like no other. Bellatar, the cinema of the apocalypse. Bellatar's films are monochromatic dredges into a pit of darkness. He began making more social realist works, however it was at the midpoint of his career that Tar truly developed the style that we know him and will remember him for. Black and white, hopeless, violent, slow. A Bellatar film weighs on you. Shots go on for 6-7 minutes at a time and take us nowhere. We're trapped in these worlds. Worlds where rain hammers the sludge-soaked ground. The wind bellows as the filth and dirt are strewn around us, and the evil spirit of man has awoken to take us all with him.
Ez ment. Évszázadokon át. Ment és ment. Csak ez ment. Néha suttyomban. Néha durván. Néha finoman. Néha brutálisan. Ment. Csak ment.
Some people struggle to make it to the end of a Bellatar work. He forces us in spaces where the very drabness of time is felt. We feel entrenched in the mud, motionless. He surveys the landscapes that seem so vast, and our realization is that we will never leave these places, and neither will our characters. And as for characters, it wouldn't be difficult to say that Tar has a pessimistic, some may even say misanthropic view of people. The drunkards throw themselves around like animals in filth. The nature of man is to debase and destroy, and all mankind is slowly sinking into its final abyss. It's incredibly dark work, with not much hope to be found within it. And yet, I'm mesmerised by it, fascinated by its horrifying truths and Tar's ability to represent the terrifying inertia that makes itself present through so much of life. The perspective may be hellish, it may even be cancerous towards the human condition, but it most certainly is a masterful perspective. Quentin Tarantino. Is there a filmmaker of this generation that's had a broader influence on the cinema of the following decade? Some would say that Tarantino is all style, no substance, and there's a relative amount of truth in that. The amazing thing about Tarantino is that he's managed to garner a career making whatever films he wanted to make. Everyone knows where his influences came from and what he's referencing. Some have taken issue with Tarantino taking plot points, shots, characters, and lifting them directly from other works and inserting them into his own. But he's never hidden this fact. His work is such a pastiche of a particular brand of exploitation films, a celebration of B-movie creativity, but elevated to something new and exciting. The fact is that if this is Tarantino's biggest filmmaking sin, then he's no different from any other filmmaker that pays homage or has something else in their methodology that others may find artistically or even ethically distasteful. And with that, all we need to do is examine what Tarantino did bring to the filmmaking landscape. A genuine reshuffling of cinematic narrative, emphasizing the dramatic possibilities for non-linear storytelling. Every single one of his movies goes back in time to introduce a character, retells a segment from another person's perspective, and the result is that this keeps the pace and intrigue of a film at a high level. The French New Wave was able to become a self-aware medium when it came to its art, but no one captured the impact of an individualized pop culture experience like Tarantino did. Art forms and pieces that only a select few managed to catch before they disappeared from general discourse. Through his sharp dialogue, which cannot be understated, Tarantino exposed just how limitless a person can be when it comes to reference. He fully captured the totality of a postmodern pop culture landscape and made it something fun, exciting, and ultimately different. Tarantino has always been like a collage filmmaker, taking a moment from a martial art film, a shot from the golden age of cinema, a song from a spaghetti western, and threw them all together in the same way that the Beastie Boys made Paul's Boutique. But just like them, there was always enough originality within it that the work separated itself as something brand new. We know a Tarantino film immediately when we see it, because so much of him is in there. We can see his lens from a mile away. It's the rockabilly, hyper-violent, saturated, pop art, foul-mouthed, exploitative love of cinema. And watching a Tarantino film is a love letter to all of film, and they act as reminders for just how much many of us really love this medium.
Which one? There's two Monroes.
No, there's not. That is Marilyn Monroe. That is Mamie Van Doren. And I don't see Jenny Mansfield, so she must have night off or something.
Wong Kar-wai. Wong Kar-wai is a filmmaker that evokes something special in his work, a kind of nostalgia for a world you've never seen before. A world that feels like the future and the past all at once. With a formidable collection of works such as In the Mood for Love, Chungking Express, and Happy Together that certified his unique vision, his films in collaboration with cinematographer Christopher Doyle are kinetic visions of a colourful universe that makes us feel in one part alienated and in another incredibly connected to it. Similar to Kieslowski, Wong Kar-wai uses the warping of the film frame to create a view of the world that's by no means synthetic, but is drawn towards neon lights, colour filters, low shutter speed jittering effects within the camera. Characters in Wong Kar-wai films are framed in all ways but traditionally, and yet the avant-garde approach is not a complete deconstruction of film form. It's rather opening new visions for how film can look. Like Yang, Wong Kar-wai views people in relation to their surroundings, always reflected in its surfaces, always caught within the crowds of where they are. There's an energy in his work that makes things both exciting and melancholic at the same time. You just see these images, and it's as though we're blurring the human with the chaos of urban life, as the two aren't fighting for space, but are learning to live symbiotically with one another. And all of this is told in stories of human connection, love stories, that which is being lost. And it's as though all of these artificial urban jungles have blended themselves so much with us that they feel it too. The world of Wong Kar-wai doesn't aim to disconnect us. It finds visions that we may find solace in the times and places that we are because we can't be anywhere else. Wherever we may feel great sorrow or heartache, we will always feel it somewhere, and that emotion will be tied to that place. That place being, for some part of us, a home. The Coen brothers. is the greatest directorial partnership since Powell and Pressburger. Joel and Ethan Coen have made work on their own, however it was their collaboration spanning over 25 years that the Coens crafted an almost unparalleled collection of oddly comedic genre pieces. The Coen brothers have such a unique style that's so idiosyncratically theirs. They love weird characters, but not absurdist weird, just kind of normal weird.
1, 2, 3, 4, all silently.
They thrust you in these worlds so full of strong characters. I'm not sure there are many filmmakers that are able to bring in cameos, single scene characters, and make them so memorable. A Coen brother film throws you in the deep end and expects you to swim alongside the strangest depictions of people and circumstances without any instance of an explanation. They just have an ability to imbue their work with such a strong identity, not just visually. Their films are primarily shot by Roger Deakins, and that wide lens back and forth between characters should never be dismissed for just how effective it can be. When you sit with these characters and just see everything around them, it's like you're there with them, and you get to experience a true sense of who they really are. There's nothing hidden, you're just experiencing this oddball world as it is. The Coens make genre pieces, but genre pieces that are specifically theirs, choosing to set Fargo, a kidnapping thriller gone awry, in the place least cinematically equipped for such an event to occur. The Big Lebowski is a rabbit hole thriller whose protagonist is barely even connected to the events at hand. They will take the bones of a noir film and fracture it, make it modern, until the whole piece becomes like a cosmic joke. The humour is bleak and slapstick, all at the same time. The world of the Coen brothers is one where things will never go right, as though the spontaneity of the universe is constantly fighting against the film even taking place. Plans will unravel, chaos will ensue, and we'll be left grasping for some meaning in a world where clearly there was none. Things happen, but isn't it unique when really interesting things happen to really simple people, and really simple things happen to really interesting people?
And it's either heads or tails. And you have to say, call it.
Well, look, I need to know what I stand to win.
Everything.
How's that?
You stand to win everything, call it.
Christopher Nolan. I have a lot of admiration for Christopher Nolan. So much discussion of the production of films is about what a filmmaker had to do in order to get the film made. They had to make sacrifices, they had to cut the budget. Nolan doesn't seem to have those issues. He's reached a level of success in his work that the idea of scale for him seems to be a non-issue. Nolan is in a privileged enough position to be able to make essentially whatever film he wants to make, and I think that he should be fondly looked upon, that in a time when studios can throw hundreds of millions in a film's advertising to make the dullest, most predictable pieces of entertainment, Nolan is always trying new forms of narrative and to push the medium forward in a myriad of ways.
Remember, you are the dreamer. You build this world. I am the subject. My mind populates it. You can literally talk to my subconscious. That's one of the ways we extract information from the subject.
He's always been a filmmaker whose vision is catalyzed by the cinematic experience. To Nolan, cinema is the theatre. He shoots in IMAX. Wherever there's a scene that can be done with practical effects, that will be opted for rather than CGI. It should be commended that at the level of blockbuster film that Nolan has been capable of making, it's always been done through some attempt at reinvention. The superhero genre was completely altered after his lens of it in the Dark Knight trilogy. The ambition of a story within a story within a story of Inception. These blockbuster reimaginings all harken back to his early work in things like Memento, where we can keep the bare bones of filmmaking relatively simple. Nolan's not a director where you'll see fourth wall breaking transgressions or sweeping deconstructed camera motions. his innovations tend to come from elsewhere. Even in his simpler stories, there remains a strong sense of identity. Nolan's work is the extravagant, that human drama should be experienced at its apex. The human story should be connected to the sound of a sweeping orchestra. Memory should not be alluded to, it should emerge vividly in the person's mind. Nolan is not a filmmaker of subtlety, but that doesn't make his filmmaking unsophisticated. If anything, at the scale he makes his films, he may be the most sophisticated of all blockbuster filmmakers of the past few decades. Park Chan-wook. If Nolan's work is the extravagant, then Park Chan-wook is cinema's ornate sadist. Park Chan-wook understands narrative as revenge, but it's a revenge embellished with the mixture of a fashionista and a surgeon. Park Chan-wook's filmmaking is precise. He composes frames like an architect, and at the same time will deliver hammer blows and rip the teeth out of the subjects inhabiting them. The style of Park Chan-wook is clean. He's like Fincher in many regards, except that his fringes fall off the scale. Park Chan-wook revels in the contradiction that cinematic vengeance bestows on us. We want characters to wreak havoc on those that have wronged them, and in doing so, we find ourselves with characters attempting to ascend through their violent retributions, all the while being dragged to the depths of hell for doing just that. There's something inherently biblical about his work. Violence is treated almost as a ritualistic thing, and all actions are intertwined with eroticism. The destruction of flesh casts us in a frenzy, yet once that subsides, we're left with a void. A character will stand in a vacuum of pure white snow when that which should have been resolved remains elusive, and the end of our path has led us to nowhere. Park Chan-wook films are operatic in their presentations, the heights of human wrath to the depths of human despair, choreographed to grand symphonies. An octopus is ripped apart. Parents watch footage of their children being murdered. We desire some grand catharsis from a Park Chan-wook film because he seats us on that dangerous edge, like a blade hovering an inch away from our eye. There is something profoundly alluring to a form of cinema that's this angelic and depraved. His films are works that seduce us into a world of violence and speak of our endless desire to purge those urges, one way or another. Asghar Farhadi. We've spoken very often about moral cinema of the past and the frequency with which it was able to emerge, but if there were a filmmaker of the modern era to recapture the very complexity of morality, then it would be Asghar Farhadi. Farhadi begins his works in the simplest of scenarios, the family home, domestic disputes, and over time they gradually unravel, and before we know it, every decision that's made begins to reverberate. These are not just familial dramas anymore, they're seismic moral tests. What does a lie become in the face of one's honour? How can we live by our value system if it's dictated to us by society? All of this takes place in a Farhadi film amongst the bubbling passion of familial love and how it can so easily become a poison, turning everything it touches into resentment. Farhadi casts no judgment on his worlds, but the films present themselves as these great stages of action where we inevitably do. And the only result we can garner from them is that people are equally guilty and innocent in all of their transgressions. A human being is made up of their religion, their status in society, their family, and you are the one that must make an absolute decision on their culpability towards sin. Farhadi is a fascinating filmmaker because he's not just a director of drama. His work has just as much intrigue as a mystery thriller. So much of his work unfolds with key information revealed to us as great revelations, completely altering our perspective of that's occurred thus far. But then, what's this teaching us? that our lens is always subject to change, that we can never achieve complete objectivity when there are infinite ways of viewing even a simple objective event. The genius of Farhadi is that this is what his cinema is built from, a collection of what-ifs, absences, things left unanswered. There is no ending. We're left stranded in the consequences of that we do not know and forced to make a decision about them. And much like the story of the masters of cinema, what makes him excel is that understanding that although there will be an infinite array of voices, you can only hear so many.